Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Relax, close your eyes, and enjoy tonight's true scary stories with gentle rain. If you enjoy the journey, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you dare. When my family first moved into the house I grew up in, I started hearing things calling my name from the opposite end of the house almost right away. Within the first few weeks of us settling in, before I had even fully unpacked all of my toys into my new room, I would be in my room, sitting on the floor, playing with Legos or doing whatever else kept me occupied as a kid, and I would clearly hear my dad calling my name from somewhere over in his room. His voice carrying easily through the hallway, the way sound does in a house you have not yet fully learned the layout and acoustics of. So I would get up, walk all the way over to my parents' bedroom, and ask them what they wanted. And every single time, without fail, they would tell me they had never called my name at all, that they had not said a single word. Being a little kid at the time, I honestly started to believe they were playing some kind of ongoing joke on me. Some game they thought was funny that they simply refused to admit to, because this kept happening roughly once every couple of days or so, consistent enough that I stopped being surprised by it and started expecting it as just another normal part of living in that house. I would trudge over there, ask my question, get the same denial, and shrug it off. Going back to whatever I had been doing before, mildly annoyed but never particularly frightened by it. I even started keeping a rough mental tally of it in my head, the way kids sometimes do with things they cannot quite make sense of, trying to spot some kind of pattern in when it happened, though I never managed to find one. Then, one night, it happened again, the same way it always did, no different from any of the dozens of previous times before it. I heard my name being called from my dad's direction, and I got up and made my way toward my parents' room, just like I had done dozens of times before, fully expecting the same routine denial waiting for me when I got there. But right as I stepped through the doorway into their room, before I could even open my mouth to ask my usual question, I heard my mom's voice calling my name again. Except this time, it was coming from the living room, all the way on the completely opposite side of the house. Distant, but perfectly clear. That was the exact moment everything shifted for me. I was standing there in the doorway, looking directly at both of my parents sitting together right in front of me, neither of them speaking, neither of them anywhere near the living room where that second call had just come from moments earlier. There was no possible way either of them could have been the source of that voice I had just heard, not unless one of them had somehow sprinted the entire length of the house and back in the span of a few seconds without me noticing. It was at that precise second that I understood, with complete and total certainty, that nobody had ever been playing a trick on me. Not once, not that whole time. I kept this realization mostly to myself after that night. Not quite sure how to bring it up again to my parents in a way that would not just lead to another round of confused denials. I did not stop hearing the voice calling my name that continued on much the same as it always had, but I stopped asking my parents about it quite so directly, having already learned that there was no ordinary explanation waiting for me on the other end of those questions. I just quietly filed it away as one of those strange, unexplainable things about our house that I would have to learn to live alongside, the way you eventually do with anything unusual that never actually causes you any real harm, treating it almost like a strange quirk of the building itself rather than something worth losing sleep over. Years later, my brother was diagnosed with partial narcolepsy, and during all the reading I did trying to understand more about his condition and what he might be experiencing on a daily basis, I came across something that caught my attention immediately. Apparently, auditory hallucinations are a recognized symptom associated with certain forms of narcolepsy, something that had never once occurred to me as a possible explanation before that point in my life. My mind immediately jumped back to all those years of hearing my name called from across the house, and I started to wonder whether maybe I had some undiagnosed version of the same condition myself, whether there was actually a straightforward medical explanation for everything I had experienced growing up that I had simply never thought to investigate properly. I went and got myself properly checked out, figuring that if there really was some kind of underlying condition responsible for what I had been hearing all those years, it would be good to finally know for certain, one way or the other, rather than continuing to wonder about it indefinitely. The results came back completely normal. No narcolepsy, no sleep disorder of any kind, nothing at all that would explain those voices in any conventional medical sense that the doctors I saw could identify. Whatever it was that had been calling my name throughout my childhood, it apparently had nothing to do with my own brain playing tricks on me in any way medical science could account for or explain. So to this day, I genuinely have no idea what was calling my name all those years growing up in that house. I never found any explanation that fully satisfied me, medical or otherwise. And my parents certainly never had any answers to offer beyond their honest, consistent denials that they had ever called out to me at all. Denials I have come to fully believe over the years, rather than continuing to suspect them of some elaborate, ongoing joke. It remains one of those loose threads in my life that has simply never been tied off. A mystery I eventually stopped actively trying to solve, and instead just learned to accept as a permanent, unresolved fact about that particular house. One small, strange detail among the many ordinary ones that make up my childhood memories of growing up there. What makes it even stranger, at least to me, is that I still hear it even now, as a fully grown adult, whenever I go back to visit my parents and end up staying overnight in my old childhood bedroom for a night or two. It has been years since I actually lived there full time. Years since I moved out and built my own separate life elsewhere, with my own home and my own routines. And yet the moment I spend a night back under that same roof, sooner or later, usually sometime after everyone else in the house has already gone to bed, I will hear my name called from somewhere within the house, clear as anything. Exactly the same way I did as a child, sitting on my bedroom floor with my Legos scattered around me. I have never told my parents that it is still happening, mostly because I am not sure what good it would actually do at this point. After all these years of them insisting they never called out to me in the first place, over and over, every single time I asked. I doubt they would have any better explanation for it now, in their own older age, than they did back then when I was still a small child asking them the same question over and over. Honestly, some part of me has simply stopped expecting any real answer at all from anyone, including myself. I've gotten used to it in a strange sort of way, the way you get used to any long-running, unresolved feature of your own life, filing it away alongside all the other small oddities that simply exist without any clear reason attached to them. I have wondered more than once over all these years whether my brother ever experienced anything similar himself, growing up in that same house alongside me, given his own eventual medical diagnosis. Though I have never actually worked up the nerve to sit down and ask him directly about it in all the years since. Part of me hesitates to bring it up at all, worried that connecting his own medical condition to my own unexplained experiences might come across as somehow suggesting his diagnosis explains mine as well, when the tests I had personally done made it pretty clear that it does not. At least not in my own particular case at all. Still, I cannot help but wonder sometimes whether there was something quite specific about that particular house itself, something in its layout or its long, unknown history that neither of us ever fully understood or ever properly looked into, that made it a place where voices like that particular one seem to exist just a little more easily than they probably should have in any ordinary, unremarkable home. My parents still live in that same house today, all these years later, having never once mentioned experiencing anything similar themselves. At least not that they have ever told me about directly in all the many conversations we have had over the years. I have sometimes wondered whether they simply never noticed anything unusual themselves during all their many years living there in that house, or whether they experienced something quite similar at some point themselves and simply chose, for their own reasons, not to mention it to me, the way I eventually chose not to keep bringing it up to them once I finally stopped expecting to get a real, satisfying answer from either one of them. It is the kind of question I have simply never quite worked up the nerve to ask them outright. Always a little worried about what kind of answer I might actually get back if I finally did. I have thought, on a few occasions over the years, about researching the deeper history of that particular property, trying to find out who exactly lived there before my own family ever moved in, whether anything unusual ever happened on that particular piece of land or within that structure that might account for the voices in some way that finally made proper sense of it all. I have never actually followed through on that particular research, partly out of a simple lack of time and partly, if I am being completely honest with myself about it, out of a genuine reluctance to find out something I might not actually want to know for certain about the place I still visit and love. There is a certain comfort in the mystery staying exactly as unresolved as it has always been, rather than risking an answer that might turn out to be far more unsettling than simply not knowing at all. My own children, if I ever have any someday, will presumably grow up hearing this story from me eventually, told the same way I grew up absorbing so many of my own parents' stories about strange and unexplainable things that happened to them over the years long before I was born. I sometimes wonder what they will make of it, whether they will believe me the way I eventually came to believe my own certainty about that night, or whether they will simply write it off as one of those slightly exaggerated family stories that gets told and retold at gatherings without anyone quite remembering how much of it is strictly literally true anymore by the time it reaches the next generation. For now, though, it remains simply my own private, unresolved memory, something I carry with me quietly, brought back to the surface every single time I find myself lying awake in that same old bedroom, waiting to hear whether tonight will be one of the nights it happens again. Whatever it actually was calling my name all those years, and whatever it apparently still is, calling out to me now during the rare nights I still spend there as a fully grown adult, I have made a kind of uneasy peace with not knowing. It does not frighten me the way it might have if I had encountered it for the first time as an adult, rather than growing up alongside it gradually as a child. It has simply always been there, a strange, quiet companion to that particular house, one that I have never been able to explain and have mostly stopped trying to. I have talked about this with a couple of close friends over the years, usually late at night, when the conversation naturally drifts toward strange, unexplainable experiences, the way it sometimes does among people who trust each other enough to share things they might not otherwise mention out loud. Most of them react the same way, laughing it off at first as some kind of childhood misunderstanding, an overactive imagination, or a simple case of sound carrying oddly through an old house with thin walls and questionable insulation between the rooms. I usually let them believe that, mostly because it is easier than trying to explain the specific, undeniable clarity of hearing two separate voices calling my name from two separate rooms in the span of just a few seconds, with both of my actual parents sitting silently in front of me the entire time. It is one of those experiences that simply does not translate well into words for anyone who was not there to live through it themselves in that exact moment. Sometimes, Lying awake in my old childhood bedroom during a visit home, waiting to see whether that particular night will be one where I hear it again, I find myself running through every possible explanation one more time, the same familiar list I always return to. A sibling playing some kind of elaborate trick that somehow escaped detection for years without ever slipping up. Some strange acoustic quirk of the house's particular construction. Sound bouncing and distorting in odd ways that only ever seem to land specifically on my own name, for reasons I cannot begin to guess at. Some medical explanation nobody has managed to properly identify yet, despite everything I have already had thoroughly tested. None of it ever quite fits neatly together, and none of it ever fully satisfies the simple, stubborn memory of that one particular night, standing in the doorway of my parents' room, hearing my own name called from a place where nobody who could have called it actually was standing. My parents are getting older now, and I sometimes think about what will eventually happen to that house once they are no longer living there. Whether whatever has been calling my name all these years will simply continue on in the empty rooms without me, calling out to nobody at all, or whether it was somehow specifically tied to me and to my presence in that house rather than to the building itself in any permanent way. I do not know the answer to that question any more than I know the answer to any of the others, and at this point in my life, I have mostly made peace with the idea that I probably never will. Some mysteries, I have come to believe, are simply meant to stay exactly that. Unresolved threads that follow you quietly through an entire lifetime, without ever fully unraveling, no matter how many years you spend turning them over in your mind. There have been a handful of times over the years when I seriously considered setting up some kind of small recording device in my old room during a visit home, just to finally see whether I could actually capture the voice properly on tape and have some kind of concrete evidence to work with at long last. Something solid beyond just my own memory and my own certainty about what I had heard. I never actually followed through on it in the end, partly out of simple laziness and partly, I think, out of a genuine fear of what I might actually end up hearing if I played that recording back the next morning. There is a certain quiet comfort in an unresolved mystery that a confirmed recording would strip away entirely and permanently. And some part of me has always genuinely preferred to keep that quiet comfort fully intact rather than risk turning a strange childhood memory into something far more concrete and far more difficult to simply set aside for good. I still visit my parents fairly regularly, several times a year at the very least, and I still sleep in that same old bedroom every single time, without exception. Never once seriously considering asking to sleep somewhere else in the house instead, just to test whether it would follow me there too. It has simply become part of the ordinary routine at this point, one small, unexplainable detail folded into an otherwise completely ordinary set of family visits. No different in practice from any other small quirk you eventually stop questioning about a place you have known and lived in for most of your entire life. I doubt I will ever get a real, satisfying answer about what it actually was, or perhaps still is, calling my name all those years ago and continuing to do so even now, but I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer particularly need one in order to keep going back for those regular visits. I need to tell you about something that happened to me and my father years ago, back when I was still a kid, still young enough to think the world made sense and that every strange thing had a normal explanation waiting behind it somewhere. That afternoon on Manassas battlefield changed that for me. It changed something in my father, too. And my father is not a man who changes easily. He is not a man who scares easily either. He spent time in combat in Vietnam. He has seen things that most people only see in nightmares, things he never talks about even now. Decades later, sitting quiet in his chair with a drink in his hand and his eyes somewhere far away. But this one thing from that gray afternoon on the battlefield still gets him, still makes the hair stand up on his arms, still makes his voice drop low when he tells it, like even now, all these years later, some part of him is worried that saying it too loud might call it back. We used to go to Manassas a lot when I was a boy. My father loved history, especially Civil War history, and Manassas battlefield was close enough to home that we could make a day of it without much planning. We would drive out early, grab breakfast on the way, sometimes McDonald's if we were running late and didn't feel like cooking, and then spend hours walking the fields where two of the bloodiest battles of the early war had been fought. He would tell me about the regiments, about the generals, about how the ground we were standing on had once been soaked with blood and covered with the bodies of boys not much older than I would grow up to be. I loved those days. I loved listening to him talk, watching his face light up the way it never did at home, seeing him become something more than just my father, something almost like a storyteller conjuring ghosts out of empty fields. The day I want to tell you about was in November, I think, though the exact month has softened a little in my memory over the years. What I remember clearly, what I will never forget, no matter how much time passes, is the weather. It was cold, that damp cold that gets into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. The kind of cold that comes with a mist so thick, it turns the whole world soft and gray at the edges. Fog rolled low over the fields that day, clinging to the ground, wrapping itself around the old cannons and the split-rail fences like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for us. Looking back now, I think that fog was the first sign that something about that day was different. Manassas is always quiet, always a little eerie if you think too hard about what happened there, but that day it felt different. It felt like the fog was hiding something, like it was holding its breath along with us. We had parked the truck on a hill that overlooked part of the old battlefield, close to a small cluster of cannons that had been placed there as a memorial. Iron and wood relics, standing silent guard over ground that had once roared with gunfire. My father lowered the tailgate, and we sat there together, eating our McDonald's, looking out over the misty fields below. It was peaceful in the way that only cold, quiet places can be peaceful. There was nobody else around that we could see. No other cars in the small gravel lot. No other visitors walking the trails. Just me and my father, our breath fogging in front of our faces, the smell of French fries mixing with the wet smell of the grass and the trees. I don't know how long we had been sitting there before we saw him. It felt like we had just settled in, still working on our food, still talking about whatever we had been talking about, when my father went quiet beside me. I followed his gaze and saw a man standing near the cannons below us, maybe 50 to 100 meters away, hard to say exactly with the fog thinning and thickening the way it was. He was dressed head to toe in what looked like full Civil War attire. The kind of thing you'd expect to see at a reenactment. Gray wool and brass buttons. The silhouette unmistakable, even from that distance. And he was waving at us. Not a friendly hello sort of wave. A come here wave, slow and deliberate. His arms sweeping toward himself and then away. Over and over. Like he needed something from us. Like he was trying to get our attention because something was wrong. My father had a pair of binoculars in the truck, and he grabbed them to get a better look. I remember watching his face while he looked through the lenses, watching his expression shift from curiosity to something more focused, more serious. He told me the man was in a Confederate uniform, and that he was standing completely stationary, feet planted, body still, the only movement coming from that one arm sweeping back and forth in that same slow, patient gesture. Come here. Come here. Come here. My father figured there must be a reenactment going on somewhere nearby that we hadn't noticed. Some group of history buffs out on the battlefield in full costume, and he thought the man might be signaling for help. Maybe someone was hurt. Maybe there was some kind of trouble happening down there in the mist that we couldn't see from our vantage point on the hill. So my father did what my father does. He got up, set down what was left of his food, and started walking down the hill toward the man, leaving me behind with the binoculars so I could keep watching from a safe distance. I remember feeling a small flutter of nervousness watching him go. The kind of nervousness a kid feels when a parent walks toward something unknown. But I didn't think much of it beyond that. I trusted my father completely. He was a big man, a strong man, a man who had survived things I couldn't even imagine at that age. There was nothing on that battlefield that could scare him. That's what I believed anyway, right up until the moment everything changed. I kept the binoculars trained on him as he walked down the slope, picking his way carefully over the uneven ground, closing the distance between himself and the waving figure by the cannons. The man kept waving the whole time, that same slow, beckoning motion, patient and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and knew exactly where my father was headed. I watched my father get closer and closer, watched him raise a hand in greeting as he approached, the way you would to let someone know you'd seen them and were coming to help. And then, when he was close, maybe only a few yards away from the man in gray, he just stopped walking. I remember lowering the binoculars for just a second to rub my eyes, thinking maybe the fog was playing tricks on the lenses. And when I looked again, my father was standing there, completely still, his whole posture different, confused, his shoulders stiff in a way I had never seen before. He wasn't moving toward the man anymore. He wasn't moving at all. He just stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds, staring at something I couldn't quite make out from where I sat. His body language screaming that something was very wrong, even though I had no idea what. And then he turned around and ran. I had never in my life seen my father run like that. He was not a young man anymore, not built for sprinting. But he covered that hillside like something was chasing him, like his life depended on getting back to that truck as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't look back, not once, not even for a second. He just ran straight up that slope through the wet grass and the fog, his breath coming out in short white bursts, his face pale, even from a distance. I stood up from the tailgate, scared now myself, even though I still didn't understand what was happening, and by the time he reached the truck, he was already grabbing everything we had brought with us, the cooler, the blanket, the trash from our lunch, throwing it all into the truck bed without any care for how it landed. He didn't say a word to me at first. He just kept moving, fast and urgent, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. We got in the truck, and he pulled out of that gravel a lot faster than I had ever seen him drive, gravel spitting out behind the tires, the whole truck shuddering as we hit the main road and put distance between ourselves and that hill. It wasn't until we were a good 10 or 15 minutes away, back on the highway with the battlefield shrinking behind us in the rearview mirror, that he finally started to talk. He told me that as he walked down toward the man, everything had seemed normal at first. The man kept waving that same slow wave, and my father had called out to him, asking if he needed help, if something was wrong. The man never answered. He never stopped waving either, not until my father got close, really close, close enough to make out details of the uniform, the brass buttons catching what little light made it through the fog, the fabric looking worn and old in a way that seemed strange for a reenactor's costume. And that's when the man stopped waving and just stood there, looking at my father. And my father said his face was wrong, somehow. Not right. Not like a normal human face should look, though he could never quite explain what exactly was wrong about it even years later when I would ask him. He said the cold hit him first. Not the ordinary cold of a misty November day, but something deeper, something that seemed to come from inside his own chest rather than from the weather around him. He said his stomach dropped the way it does when you miss a step going downstairs, that sick, lurching feeling, and goosebumps rose up his arms and the back of his neck all at once, like his whole body was screaming at him to run before his mind had even caught up to why. And then, he said, while he was standing there frozen, staring at this man who was staring back at him with that wrong, unreadable face, the man began to fade. Not walk away, not turn and leave. Fade, the way smoke fades into open air, the way a shape dissolves into mist until there is nothing left of it but empty space and the cold feeling it leaves behind. That was when my father turned and ran. Here is the part of the story that still unsettles me the most, the part that I have gone over in my head 1,000 times since that day. From where I sat on the hill, watching through the binoculars, I never saw the man disappear. Not once. As far as I could tell from my vantage point, my father was standing right next to him the entire time, the two of them close together. And then suddenly, my father was running back toward me, while the man just remained there, stationary, still visible, still standing by the cannons in his gray uniform. I never saw him fade. I never saw him vanish. To my eyes, he was simply there, watching my father run, and then eventually, at some point I couldn't pinpoint exactly, he was gone, but not in any dramatic or visible way that I witnessed. Just gone, the way something can slip out of your attention if you're not looking directly at it. We have talked about that day many times over the years since, my father and I, comparing our memories, trying to make some kind of sense out of what happened. He is absolutely certain about what he saw, the fading, the wrongness of the man's face, the way the cold and the fear hit him all at once like a wave. And I am absolutely certain about what I saw, or rather what I didn't see, the fact that from my angle the man never appeared to vanish while my father was standing right there next to him. Neither one of us has ever been able to explain that discrepancy. Neither one of us has ever wanted to go back to that spot to try and get an explanation either. What strikes me most, even now, is how my father reacts when he tells this story. This is a man who does not scare easily. This is a man who has faced things in his life that most people will never have to face. Real dangers. Real horrors, the kind that leave scars you can't always see. And yet every single time he tells this story, even decades later, sitting comfortable in his own living room with nothing around him but familiar walls and warm light, he gets the chills. His voice changes. His hands sometimes tighten on whatever he's holding. A coffee cup, the arm of his chair. And there is a look that crosses his face that I have never seen when he talks about anything else, not even the things from his time in the war. It is a specific kind of fear, quiet and deep, the kind that doesn't come from remembering danger, but from remembering something that simply should not have been possible, something that broke the rules of what he understood the world to be. We don't know what we saw that day. We have talked about every rational explanation. A reenactor who wandered off in a strange way, some trick of the fog and the light, a stranger playing some elaborate and pointless prank on two people he had never met. None of those explanations have ever felt right to either of us. Not the way my father described that face. Not the way the cold hit him so suddenly and so completely. Not the way the man seemed to fade from existence right in front of him, while somehow, impossibly, still standing solid and visible from where I watched through the binoculars. I think about that battlefield sometimes, even now, all these years later. I think about all those young men who died there. Boys, really. Some of them younger than I am now. Cut down in fields that eventually became peaceful and green again. Walked by families with their children. Visited by history lovers with their cameras and their picnic lunches. I wonder sometimes if some of them never really left. If some part of what happened on that ground all those years ago is still out there. Still waiting in the fog for someone to notice. Still trying, in whatever way something like that can try, to get somebody's attention. To wave someone over. To ask for help that can never actually be given. Not anymore. Not after all this time. We haven't been back to Manassas since that day. We've talked about going every so often, usually late at night, when the conversation drifts toward old memories and my father starts telling the story again, almost without meaning to. Like it lives just under the surface of him, always ready to come back up. But neither of us has ever actually made the drive back out there. I don't think we ever will. Some places, I've come to believe, are better left as memories, better left as stories you tell, rather than experiences you go looking to repeat. Whatever that man was, whoever or whatever we saw standing by those cannons that misty November afternoon, I don't think either of us wants to give it the chance to wave us over again. When I was very small, my mother and I lived together in an old Victorian house. Just the two of us. A tight little family of only two people against everything else out there. She raised me alone. Worked hard for everything we had. And that house, despite its age and its creaks and its strange draughts that seemed to come from nowhere, was the only home I really remember from my early childhood. It had tall ceilings and narrow hallways and a staircase that groaned no matter how carefully you stepped on it. The kind of place that feels like it has 100 years of history soaked into its walls, whether you want to think about that or not. I loved that house in the simple, uncomplicated way only a small child can love a place. I had no idea, not really, not until years later, just how much that house had loved having us there too, in its own way. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old when it started. I don't remember the very first night clearly. The way memory tends to blur together at that age until certain moments burn themselves permanently into your mind while everything around them fades. What I do remember, what has never left me, is the laughing. Nighttime laughter, coming from somewhere out in the hallway beyond my bedroom door, soft at first, almost playful. The kind of giggling you might expect from another child somewhere nearby having fun in the dark. I would lie there in my bed, wide awake, staring at the thin strip of light under my door, listening to that laughter drift past, and I never felt brave enough to get up and look. I told my mother about it, of course, the way any small child would. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, tugging at her sleeve while she made breakfast, telling her about the laughing in the hallway, asking her if she had heard it too. She barely looked up from what she was doing. She told me it was probably just the television, that she must have left it on downstairs and forgotten to switch it off before bed, that the sound must have carried up through the old pipes and thin walls of the house in some strange way that made it sound closer than it actually was. It was a reasonable explanation. Old houses do strange things with sound, and I was young enough to accept almost any explanation an adult offered me without question. So I let it go, or at least I tried to, even though something in the back of my mind never quite believed her. The laughter kept coming, though, night after night, week after week. Sometimes I would hear it right as I was drifting off to sleep, a faint sound weaving its way into the edges of my dreams. Other times it would wake me suddenly, pulling me straight up out of sleep with my heart already pounding, before I even understood why. It was never loud, It was never aggressive or frightening in the way you might imagine, at least not at first. It was just laughter, light and airy, the kind of sound that under any other circumstances would have made me smile, instead of hide beneath my blankets with my eyes squeezed shut, waiting for morning. I stopped mentioning it to my mother after a while. I think even at that young age I understood, in some instinctive way children often do, that I wasn't going to get a different answer no matter how many times I brought it up. She had already decided it was the television, or the pipes, or the wind finding its way through the old window frames, and nothing I said was going to change her mind. So I kept it to myself, night after night, and I learned to live with the sound the way you learn to live with anything frightening that never quite goes away. You get used to it, or you convince yourself you have, and life goes on around it. Until the night, everything changed. I don't remember exactly how old I was on that particular night, but I know I was still small, still young enough that everything around me felt huge and strange and only partly explainable. I woke up the way I always did on the bad nights, pulled suddenly out of sleep by the sound of laughter, except this time it wasn't drifting in from the hallway outside my door. This time, it was right there in my room with me, close enough that I felt the sound settle over my bed like something with weight and presence, rather than just noise passing through the walls. I tried to sit up. That was the first instinct, the automatic response of a frightened child wanting to see what was happening, wanting the comfort of sitting upright and alert rather than lying flat and vulnerable in the dark. But I couldn't move. I felt hands on my shoulders, pressing down, firm and strong, adult-sized hands gripping into my small shoulders and holding me flat against the mattress, no matter how hard I tried to push myself up. I couldn't see anyone. There was nothing there, nothing visible in the dim light of my room, and yet I could feel those hands as clearly and as solidly as if someone had been kneeling right beside my bed, pinning me down with real, physical strength. I screamed. I don't remember making a conscious decision to scream. It just happened, pulled out of me by pure terror. The kind of sound that comes from somewhere deep and instinctive, rather than anywhere thoughtful. I screamed with everything my small body had in it, and somewhere above me, or maybe all around me, the laughter continued, unbothered by my terror, almost as if my fear was simply part of whatever game was being played. My mother came running. I remember the sound of her feet pounding down the hallway, the door bursting open, her hands slapping against the switch of my bedside lamp, so the room flooded suddenly with warm yellow light. She was already talking before she even reached my bed, telling me it was just a dream, that everything was fine, that she was there now, and nothing could hurt me. She pulled me into her arms, and I remember how badly I was shaking. How I couldn't seem to stop crying even with her holding me, even with the light on and the room looking perfectly normal and empty around us. I told her it hadn't been a dream. I told her someone had been holding me down. I told her my shoulders hurt, and I think it was the way I said it, the specific, physical complaint of it. That made her pause. A child crying about a bad dream is one thing. A child telling you a very precise detail like that is something different, something that doesn't fit as neatly into the explanation of nightmares and overactive imagination. She lifted my t-shirt to look. I don't remember her exact reaction in that moment, not clearly. The way you don't always remember the precise expressions on someone's face during the most frightening moments of your life, only the feeling of it. The way the room seemed to change, even though nothing physical about it had. What I do know, what she told me, and what I came to understand as I got older, is that there were marks on my shoulders. Handprints, 2 of them, 1 on each shoulder, sized for adult hands, not a child's, not mine, not hers, pressed into my skin, dark enough to be seen clearly under the lamp light. Dark enough that there was no mistaking them for anything except exactly what they appeared to be. In the days that followed, life in the house continued much as it had before, though something between my mother and me had shifted in a way I couldn't fully name at that age. She checked on me more often at night, standing in my doorway for long stretches, before finally going back to her own room, as though she wasn't quite ready to trust the quiet of the house the way she used to. She never brought up the handprints again, not directly, though I noticed she started leaving the hallway light on every single night from that point forward, something she had never bothered with before. I remember asking her about it once, why the light stayed on now when it never used to, and she just said it was easier to see in the dark that way. Easier for both of us to get up in the night if we needed to. I didn't question it further. Children accept small changes in routine without demanding explanations the way adults do, and I simply absorbed this new habit into the shape of our daily life without giving it much more thought. The laughing didn't stop completely after that night, though it changed in some way I struggled to articulate, even as a child. It became softer, more distant again, more like it had been in the early days before it moved into my room and settled over my bed. I would still hear it drifting through the hallway some nights, faint and far away, but it never came close again, not the way it had that one terrible time. I used to lie awake sometimes, wondering if whatever had been in my room that night was still there, watching from some corner I couldn't see, waiting for another opportunity, or if it had simply retreated back into whatever part of the house it usually occupied, content for the time being to stay at a distance. I never found an answer to that question, and eventually, the way children do, I simply stopped asking it of myself and let the fear fade into background noise, something I lived alongside rather than something I actively confronted every single night. We ended up moving out of that house a couple of years later, though I don't remember the exact reason my mother gave for the move at the time. She said something about needing more space or wanting to be closer to her work. Small, practical explanations that made perfect sense to a young child who had no reason to question them. Looking back now as an adult, I wonder how much of that decision was really about space or convenience, and how much of it was about getting the two of us as far away from that house and whatever lived inside its walls as she possibly could. She never said so outright, not then and not in all the years since, but there was always something in the way she talked about that old Victorian house afterward, a certain carefulness in her tone, a way of glossing quickly over the subject whenever it came up that made me suspect she knew far more than she ever let on. For years afterward, I genuinely believed I had imagined the whole thing. Childhood memories are strange and slippery things, especially the frightening ones, and as I grew older, I convinced myself, or maybe just allowed myself to be convinced, that the entire incident had been some elaborate combination of nightmare and half-waking confusion. The kind of thing children experience all the time and later misremember as something more solid and real than it actually was. It became, in my mind, just another strange childhood memory, filed away alongside imaginary friends and monsters under the bed, not something to be taken seriously as an adult. That belief held, mostly undisturbed, for a very long time. Until recently. I was talking to my mother the other day. Nothing serious. Just the kind of meandering conversation you have with a parent about old memories, old houses, old stories from when I was small. I mentioned the Victorian house almost as an afterthought. And then, half joking, I brought up the laughing in the hallway, the night the hands held me down, the handprints on my shoulders. I expected her to laugh it off the way she always had, to tell me again that it had probably just been the television, that children imagine all sorts of things, that it was nothing more than an old, faded memory not worth dwelling on. She didn't laugh. She went pale, properly pale, the color draining from her face in a way I had never seen before, not over something as small as a passing comment about an old memory. And then she said something I will never forget, something that has stayed with me every single night since, replaying in my mind whenever the house goes quiet and dark around me. She said, "I don't want to remember that." That was it. That was all she said. She didn't explain further, didn't offer any additional details, didn't try to rationalize it away with talk of televisions or old pipes or overactive childhood imagination the way she always had before. She just said those 6 words, quiet and heavy, and then changed the subject so quickly and so deliberately that I understood. In that moment, there was nothing more she was willing to say about it. Whatever she remembered from that night, whatever she had seen or felt or understood about those handprints on my small shoulders, it was something she had spent years actively trying not to think about, something she had buried so deeply that even a passing mention of it was enough to drain the color from her face and shut the conversation down entirely. I haven't asked her about it again since. I don't think I will. There is something in the way she reacted. Something in that brief flash of genuine fear crossing the face of the one person who has always been the steady, unshakable center of my world that tells me I don't actually want to know more. Whatever she saw or understood that night, all those years ago, standing over my bed with the lamp light spilling across handprints that shouldn't have been there, it is clearly something she has decided is better left buried. And for the first time in my life, I find myself agreeing with her completely. I still think about that house sometimes, the tall ceilings, the groaning staircase, the drafts that never seem to come from anywhere in particular. I think about the laughter in the hallway, the way it used to drift past my door at night, soft and playful, and somehow worse for being so gentle rather than menacing. Mostly, though, I think about those 2 handprints, adult-sized, pressed into the shoulders of a small sleeping child, left there by hands that were never visible, never explained, and apparently never fully spoken of again by the one adult who actually saw them with her own eyes. Whatever was in that house with us all those years ago, I have come to believe it was real, solid enough to leave marks on skin, patient enough to visit night after night for years, and apparently significant enough that even now, decades later, my own mother would rather carry the memory in silence than ever speak its details aloud again. Sometimes I try to imagine what it must have looked like from her perspective that night, running down the hallway toward the sound of her child screaming, flicking on that lamp, and finding marks on my small shoulders that no living person in that house could have left. I wonder what expression crossed her face in that first instant, before she composed herself enough to comfort me, before she settled into the calm, reassuring voice she used for the rest of that night, and for every night afterward, when the subject came dangerously close to resurfacing. I wonder if some part of her recognized, immediately and instinctively, exactly what she was looking at, even if she never allowed herself to say the word for it out loud. Not to me, and maybe not even to herself in the quiet of her own thoughts. I have looked into the history of that old Victorian house a little over the years, not obsessively, just enough to satisfy a curiosity that never quite goes away, no matter how much I try to leave the whole thing behind me. I never found anything definitive, no dramatic tragedy attached to its name, no newspaper clipping describing some terrible event within its walls that might explain the laughter or the hands or the strange, cold presence that seemed to occupy its hallways at night. Maybe that absence of explanation is its own kind of answer. Maybe not every house needs a bloody history to hold on to something unexplainable. Maybe some places simply collect things over the years the way old wood collects dust, quietly, patiently, without any single dramatic moment to point back to, Until eventually there is simply something there that was never there before, waiting in the dark for someone small and unsuspecting to notice. What I keep coming back to, more than anything else, is my mother's face in that recent conversation. The way the color drained so completely and so quickly, the moment I brought up something I had genuinely believed was nothing more than a half-remembered childhood dream. Adults are supposed to have all the answers. Growing up, I always assumed that whatever secrets or fears existed in my childhood, my mother understood them fully, had already processed, and filed them away somewhere safe, protecting me from whatever version of the truth was too heavy for a child to carry. Seeing her react the way she did, all these years later, as a grown woman who has weathered so much in her life, made me realize for the first time that some fears never actually get resolved. They just get buried, carried quietly for decades, waiting for an unexpected moment to surface again, as sharp and as real as the night they were first created. During my very first semester of college, right when I was still trying to figure out how to be an adult living away from home for the first time, my whole world got turned upside down when my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was the kind of news that arrives in a phone call and instantly makes everything else in your life feel small and unimportant. One moment I was worrying about class schedules and roommates and all the ordinary things a new college student worries about. And the next moment, none of that mattered at all. My family needed help, and I made the decision fairly quickly to move in with my grandmother and my grandfather so I could be there for them during whatever time we had left together. The doctors told us she had about 2 months to live. That is a brutal thing to hear about anyone, but especially about someone who raised you, who was such a steady presence throughout your entire childhood. 2 months. I remember doing the math in my head, counting out the weeks, trying to prepare myself emotionally for an ending that felt impossibly close. But my grandmother, stubborn and strong in ways that always defined her, ended up defying that timeline completely. She held on for 9 months instead of 2, 9 months of good days and terrible days, of quiet mornings and difficult nights, of all of us trying to make the most of whatever time remained. Looking back now, I am endlessly grateful for those extra 7 months, even though every single one of them was heavy with the knowledge of what was eventually coming. Living in that house during those months changed me in ways I am still discovering even now. I helped my grandfather manage her medications, sat with her through the long afternoons when the pain was bad, learned to recognize the small signs that told us when a good day was turning into a difficult one. I remember the rhythm those months settled into, mornings spent making sure she had eaten something, however small. Afternoons filled with quiet conversation when she had the energy for it, and evenings where the house grew heavy with the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for someone you love while watching them slowly slip away. I was still technically a college student during this time, attending classes when I could manage it, submitting assignments late more often than I would like to admit. But none of that ever felt as important as simply being present in that house, available for whatever she or my grandfather might need from 1 hour to the next. My grandmother had always been a strong woman throughout her whole life, the kind of person who built a household through sheer will and steady determination. And even as the illness slowly took more and more from her physically, that underlying strength never fully disappeared. There were days she insisted on getting out of bed even when the doctors and the rest of us thought she shouldn't, days she wanted to sit in her favorite chair by the window rather than stay confined to the hospital bed we had set up in what used to be a guest room. I think that's stubbornness, more than anything else. Explains how she managed to stretch 2 predicted months into 9 actual ones. She simply refused to leave on anyone else's timeline but her own. And there is something both admirable and heartbreaking about watching someone fight that hard against an outcome everyone already understands is inevitable. The house itself became something different during that time, too. Less like the place I had visited for holidays as a child, and more like a shared space of quiet grief and determined hope, all mixed together in a way that is hard to explain unless you have lived through something similar yourself. Every room seemed to carry a different weight depending on the day. The kitchen was where my grandfather and I would sit in exhausted silence after difficult nights. The living room was where family would gather during her better weeks, trying to create some sense of normalcy, even as we all understood how limited our remaining time together truly was. And her bedroom slowly transformed from a familiar, comfortable space into something closer to a small hospital room, filled with medical equipment and the particular kind of quiet that surrounds serious illness. She passed away eventually, the way we all knew she would, though knowing something is coming never actually prepares you for the moment it arrives. The house felt profoundly different after that. Quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with actual sound levels and everything to do with the absence of a presence that had filled those rooms for so many years. My grandfather grieved in his own quiet way, and I stayed on for a while longer, partly to support him and partly because I wasn't entirely ready to leave the place where I had spent those last intense months of her life. It was during this period, after her passing, that things started happening in the house. Things I have never been able to fully explain and have mostly stopped trying to explain. Because some things, I have come to believe, simply exist outside the boundaries of what we can rationally understand. The first time it happened, I was alone in the house during the day, my grandfather out running errands. The place quiet, in that particular way empty houses get quiet, where even small sounds seem amplified against the stillness. I was walking from one room to another, thinking about nothing in particular, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye down the hallway. I turned my head instinctively, the way anyone would, and for just a moment, barely longer than a flicker, I saw her. My grandmother, walking through the hallway the way she used to, moving in that familiar, unhurried way she always had. Gone again almost as quickly as I had noticed her. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters for understanding how I experienced all of this. I was never frightened by these moments. Not once. There was nothing menacing or threatening about what I was seeing. Nothing that made my heart race with fear the way you might expect from a ghost story. It felt, instead, oddly natural. Oddly comforting, even. Like catching a glimpse of someone you love out of the corner of your eye in a crowded room. That instant of recognition before you remember they aren't actually supposed to be there. It caught me off guard every single time. Made my breath catch a little in my chest. But fear was never really the dominant emotion. It was something closer to bittersweet surprise. A strange kind of comfort tangled up with the reminder of loss. This happened more than once during those weeks and months after her death. Sometimes I would be sitting in the computer room, working on something for one of my classes, focused on the glow of the screen in front of me, and I would suddenly become aware of a presence behind me. A sense that someone was sitting on the bed that occupied part of that room, close enough that I could almost feel the weight of their attention on the back of my neck. I never turned around fast enough to see anything concrete during those moments, but the feeling itself was unmistakable and consistent. The same specific sensation every single time. So distinct that I eventually stopped questioning what it meant and simply accepted it as one more strange element of living in that particular house during that particular period of grief. There was a particular quality to that sensation that I have never been able to fully put into words, even now, years later. It wasn't a cold feeling, the way ghost stories often describe supernatural presence. If anything, It felt warm, familiar, almost exactly like the sensation of sitting in a room with someone you know well and love. Someone whose attention you can sense without needing to look up and confirm it. I would sometimes catch myself starting to speak out loud, half-formed words rising up before I stopped myself, remembering that there was no one physically there to hear whatever I might have been about to say. Other times, I simply let myself sit in that feeling for a few extra minutes before turning around, allowing myself the strange, quiet comfort of it rather than rushing to disprove or explain it away. I have thought about those experiences many times since then. Trying to make sense of them in whatever way felt right to me. I never told many people about them at the time, partly because I worried about how it would sound, and partly because the experiences felt oddly personal, almost sacred in a strange way. Like something meant just for me, and not really meant for sharing casually in conversation. But they were real to me. As real as anything else I experienced during that difficult year. And I have never found a way to dismiss them as simple imagination or grief-induced hallucination, even though I know that is the more common, more rational explanation that most people would reach for. There is one particular incident from that time, though, that stands apart from all the others, an experience I shared with someone else, which somehow makes it both more validating and more unsettling than anything I experienced alone. I was dating someone during that period, a girl who would sometimes come by the house to spend time with me between classes and my responsibilities helping care for my grandmother, and later, after her passing, simply to keep me company during those quiet, grief-heavy months. One afternoon, she stopped by the house, and at some point during her visit, I needed to step out into the garage to grab something, leaving her waiting inside for just a few minutes while I went to retrieve whatever it was. When I came back in from the garage, I found her waiting for me in the laundry room, which sat directly adjacent to the garage door. Connecting that part of the house together in a small, practical space filled with the usual things you'd expect: a washer and dryer, shelves of detergent, the ordinary clutter of household chores. She had been waiting there for me, and when I walked back in, we shared a brief hug, the kind of casual, affectionate moment you have with someone you're dating. Nothing unusual or noteworthy about it in any way. And then we both heard it at the same time. The sound of a dog running through the house. Not a vague, ambiguous noise that could have been anything, but a very specific, very recognizable sound. The distinct clicking and scraping of a dog's nails against tile flooring. The kind of sound anyone who has ever owned a dog with claws long enough to click against hard floors would recognize instantly. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house, and it was getting closer, the sound growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. Exactly the way it would if an actual dog were running at full speed through the hallways toward us. We looked at each other first, both of us clearly hearing the same thing, both of us confused, because we knew, without needing to say it out loud, that there was no dog in that house. My grandparents didn't own a dog anymore. There was nothing living in that house that could have made that sound. And yet the sound continued, undeniable and growing closer, until it rounded the corner into view. And we both saw it at the same time. A dog, running at full speed, low to the ground the way dogs run when they're excited or playing, moving with total confidence and momentum through a house it clearly knew intimately, right past us, directly between our legs, close enough that we both instinctively flinched, and straight through the closed door that separated the laundry room from the garage. Through the closed door, not toward it, not stopping in front of it the way a real dog would if the door were shut, but through it, disappearing into the garage on the other side as though the solid wood and metal simply weren't there at all for whatever we had just witnessed. Neither of us said anything for several long seconds afterward. We just stood there, staring at the closed door the dog had apparently passed through without any hesitation or obstruction. Both of us processing what had just happened in that particular kind of silence that settles over people who have just witnessed something that fundamentally does not make sense, according to everything they understand about how the world is supposed to work. Eventually, we looked at each other, and I remember the look on her face mirrored exactly what I imagined my own face looked like in that moment. A mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a kind of wide-eyed shock that comes from having just shared an experience with another person that you both know defies rational explanation. We didn't stay in the house much longer after that. I don't remember exactly what we said to each other in the immediate aftermath, only that we both seemed to reach an unspoken agreement that it was time to leave, to get some distance from whatever we had just witnessed, even though neither of us felt particularly frightened in a dramatic sense. It was more disorienting than frightening, the kind of experience that leaves you needing time and space to simply sit with what happened before you can even begin trying to process or explain it. It was only later, once we had left the house and had some time to talk about it more calmly, that I put together exactly what dog we had seen. My grandparents had owned a dog many years earlier, long before that particular period of my life. A dog that had passed away when I was only about 2 years old. I have no independent memory of that dog at all. None whatsoever. Only the knowledge of him that comes from old photographs I had seen over the years. Pictures scattered throughout the house and in old family albums, showing a dog I never actually knew in any real, remembered sense. My girlfriend at the time, understandably shaken by what we had just witnessed together, asked me a lot of questions in the days that followed, wanting to know more about the house, about my grandmother, about whether I had experienced anything like this before that afternoon. I told her about the hallway sightings, about the presence I sometimes felt in the computer room, and I remember her going quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining, processing everything in the way you do when the ordinary rules you have always trusted about reality suddenly seem a little less solid than they used to. She never became afraid of the house exactly, but she was noticeably more careful around it after that day, more attentive to sounds and movement whenever she visited, as though some part of her was always half expecting something else to happen. When I described what we had seen to my grandfather later, mentioning the general appearance, the size, the way it moved, he confirmed almost immediately that it matched that old dog perfectly. Right down to specific details I hadn't even consciously registered while watching it run past us. It was clearly, unmistakably, the same animal that had lived in that house decades earlier. An animal that had died before I was old enough to form any conscious memories of him. An animal that both my girlfriend at the time and I had somehow seen together, clearly, undeniably, running through that house exactly the way he must have run through it countless times while he was still alive. I have turned that experience over in my mind countless times in the years since. The fact that I saw my grandmother in the hallways of that house after her death is something I could potentially explain away, at least in theory, as grief manifesting itself in my mind. My subconscious processing loss, in whatever strange way subconscious minds sometimes do, conjuring familiar images out of memory and longing. I have never fully believed that explanation myself, but I understand why someone else might reach for it. It is harder, though, much harder, to explain away an experience shared by two separate people at the same exact moment, witnessing the exact same specific, detailed thing, an animal that neither of us had any particular reason to be thinking about, an animal I barely even remembered existing in any concrete sense before that afternoon. That house, I have come to firmly believe, held on to things. Not in a threatening way, not in the way houses are portrayed in the more frightening kinds of ghost stories, with malevolent presences and dangerous hauntings meant to do harm to the living. Whatever remained in that house after my grandmother passed away, and whatever brought that old dog back through those hallways after so many years of absence, never once felt dangerous or hostile. It felt, if anything, like an echo of love and familiarity, like pieces of a life so full and so deeply lived that they simply refused to fully disappear, even after the physical body that had lived that life was gone. I think about my grandmother often, and I think about that house, and I think about the strange, quiet months I spent there during her final illness, and in the period immediately following her death. I think about catching glimpses of her in the hallway, about sensing her presence sitting behind me in the computer room while I tried to focus on schoolwork that felt increasingly unimportant against the backdrop of everything happening around me. And I think, especially about that afternoon in the laundry room, about the sound of claws against tile growing louder and closer. About a dog I had no real memory of running full speed through a house he clearly still considered home, disappearing through a closed door as though it were nothing more than empty air. I don't have any grand explanation for any of it. I am not someone who claims to fully understand the nature of what happens after death, or what allows certain places to hold on to pieces of the people and animals who once lived within them. What I do know with complete certainty is that I experienced these things, that another person experienced at least one of them alongside me, and that neither of us could find any rational way to explain what we had witnessed that afternoon in the laundry room. I have stopped needing an explanation, honestly. Some experiences simply exist as they are, unresolved and unexplainable, and I have made peace with carrying this one forward as one of the strangest, and in its own way, most meaningful memories from an otherwise heartbreaking period of my life. Sometimes I wonder if that old dog was there for a reason beyond simple habit, or lingering attachment to a place he once knew. I wonder if, in whatever strange way animals and spirits might understand loss and connection, he sensed that my grandmother had recently passed, and had come looking for her the same way he might have gone looking for her decades earlier when she was still alive, and he was still a living, breathing dog running through the rooms of that familiar house. I have no way of knowing if that is true, no way of proving any theory I might construct about what we witnessed that day. But it is a comforting thought. In its own strange way, imagining that even in whatever place or form these things exist after death, some connections remain strong enough to bring a beloved pet back through a house he once called home, chasing after the scent or memory or presence of someone who had recently joined him in whatever comes after this life. I still find myself thinking, every so often, about how ordinary that afternoon started out, how nothing about it suggested anything unusual was about to happen. We were just two young people spending time together, sharing a quiet moment in a laundry room while I finished a small errand in the garage. There was no warning, no build-up, nothing that hinted at what we were about to witness together. That, more than anything, is what stays with me the most. The way something so extraordinary can arrive completely unannounced, folded quietly into an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, leaving you changed in some small but permanent way before you've even had time to brace yourself for it. I have shared this story with only a handful of people over the years since it happened, and I have noticed that reactions tend to split fairly evenly between genuine fascination and polite, skeptical silence. I understand both responses completely. I know how it sounds, recounting an experience like this from the outside, and I don't blame anyone for finding it difficult to accept at face value. But I was there. My girlfriend at the time was there too, standing right beside me, hearing exactly what I heard and seeing exactly what I saw, and no amount of polite, skepticism from anyone else has ever been enough to make either of us doubt what actually happened in that laundry room that afternoon. Some experiences simply belong to the people who lived through them, carried forward as private certainty even when the rest of the world remains understandably unconvinced. My grandfather stayed in that house for a while after I eventually moved out and returned to focusing more fully on my college life, though our conversations about my grandmother and occasionally about the stranger experiences from that period continued for years afterward. He never seemed particularly surprised by what I described to him, accepting these accounts with a kind of quiet, weathered calm that suggested he might have had his own experiences in that house that he simply chose not to share in detail. There was an unspoken understanding between us, I think, that the house held on to something of her, something of that old life we had all shared together before illness and loss reshaped everything, and that this lingering presence was simply a part of the house now, woven into its walls and hallways the same way any long history eventually becomes part of a place. I don't live anywhere near that house anymore, and my grandfather eventually moved as well, the property passing on to new owners who have no idea, presumably, about any of what happened within those walls during that particular year of my life. I sometimes wonder what they experience there now, if anything, or if whatever remained of my grandmother and that old childhood dog eventually moved on once the people who remembered and loved them were no longer present in that space day after day. I like to imagine, in my more sentimental moments, that they found their way to wherever they were always meant to be together, reunited in whatever form that reunion takes, no longer needing to linger in the hallways of an old house, glimpsed only occasionally by a grieving college student trying to make sense of loss during the hardest year of his young life. And even now, whenever I hear the particular sound of claws clicking against the hard floor somewhere nearby, some small, quiet part of me still turns to look, just in case. A couple of friends and I were at the annual fair that came through our local park every year, the kind of small-town event everyone looked forward to for months in advance, with rides that creaked a little too much and food stands selling greasy fries and cotton candy that stuck to your fingers. There was always something exciting about that particular week. The way the whole park transformed almost overnight, ordinary green fields suddenly filled with towering rides, flashing lights, carnival games lined up in rows, and the constant hum of generators and music blending together into a sound that meant summer was truly in full swing. We had been counting down the days for weeks beforehand, planning out what rides we wanted to go on first, which games we thought we could actually win, and how much of our saved allowance money we were willing to spend on food that we all knew our parents wouldn't approve of. We were 14 that year, right at that particular age where you desperately want to feel older than you actually are, where hanging around with a big crowd of families and little kids suddenly feels embarrassing instead of fun. At that age, being seen the wrong way by classmates or older kids from school felt like the worst possible outcome of any evening out. And something about wandering the fairgrounds alongside strollers and toddlers on shoulders made us feel distinctly uncool, distinctly like children ourselves, rather than the almost grown teenagers we were so desperate to be seen as. So the three of us decided we would be cool, that we would separate ourselves from the noise and the lights and the crowds, and go find something quieter, something that felt more like an adventure than a typical fair night, something that would let us feel independent and daring in a way that simply riding the Ferris wheel one more time never could. There was a walking trail that started right at the edge of the fairgrounds, a long path that wound through the park for a few miles, before eventually looping back around. During the day, it was a popular spot for joggers and families out for a walk, lined with trees and benches, the kind of place that felt completely safe and unremarkable under sunlight, dotted with the occasional dog walker or group of cyclists passing by. That evening, though, the sun had already gone down, and the trail felt different in ways none of us really thought about at the time. We were 14 and invincible in the way only 14-year-olds can be, convinced that nothing bad ever actually happens to real people, especially not to us. The lighting along the trail was bad, patchy at best, with old lamp posts spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of near total darkness between each small pool of orange light. We didn't think much of it in the moment. We were laughing about something, gossiping the way teenage girls do, feeling proud of ourselves for stepping away from the crowd and finding our own little corner of independence for the evening. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sound of fair music and the occasional shriek from someone on one of the rides, fading further and further behind us the deeper into the trail we walked. Eventually, we reached a spot that became, without any of us really planning it, our resting point for the evening. There was a tunnel built into the side of a hill, one of those older park structures meant to let the walking trail pass underneath the road above without forcing pedestrians to cross traffic. The hill leading up to the mouth of the tunnel was fairly steep and quite secluded compared to the rest of the trail, tucked away from the main path with trees on either side that blocked most of the ambient light from the fairgrounds behind us. We climbed up and settled ourselves right at the entrance of the tunnel, sitting close together on the cool concrete, still talking and laughing, still feeling that particular thrill of having found a spot that felt entirely our own for the night. Looking back now, I recognize how isolated that spot actually was. At the time, it just felt private, felt special somehow, like we had discovered a secret little corner of the park that belonged only to us. We had no real awareness of how far we had wandered from the safety of the crowded fairgrounds, no real sense of how alone we truly were up on that hill, tucked into the mouth of a tunnel, with barely any light reaching us at all. We had been sitting there for a while, long enough that our eyes had adjusted somewhat to the darkness, when we noticed a woman approaching us from further down the trail. She had a baby with her, cradled against her chest, moving at a careful, deliberate pace up the hill toward where we sat. There was something about the way she approached us that made all three of us go quiet, stop our conversation, and just watch her climb toward us. A small prickle of attention rising in all of us even before she said a single word. When she reached us, she didn't waste any time on small talk. She asked, fairly directly, and without much hesitation, if we knew a man who was currently standing at the bottom of the hill, near one of the benches that lined the main trail below. She gestured back the way she had come, and we all turned to look in that direction. Sure enough, there was a man standing near the bench she had mentioned, still and quiet, positioned in a way that made it clear he was looking up the hill, looking directly toward where the three of us sat, at the mouth of the tunnel. We told her no, that we didn't know him, that we had never seen him before in our lives. I remember the way her expression shifted slightly when we said that, something tightening in her face, something careful entering her voice as she continued speaking. She told us that he had been following her and following us for a while now. She said she didn't know exactly what he was up to, what his intentions might be, but that something about the way he was moving, the way he kept his distance while never quite disappearing, had unsettled her enough to make the climb up the hill, just to warn a group of teenage girls she had never met before that evening. She told us, plainly and seriously, that we should be careful. I don't think any of us fully understood, in that exact moment, just how frightening that warning actually was. We were 14, and there is a strange kind of denial that comes with that age, a belief that even direct warnings from strangers can't possibly apply to something as serious as real danger. We thanked her, I think, said something reassuring. The kind of thing teenagers say to adults when they want to seem calm and in control, even when they're not entirely sure what to feel. She lingered for just a moment longer, glancing back down the hill toward the man near the bench, before continuing on her own way, disappearing further along the trail with her baby still held close against her chest. I remember watching her walk away, wondering even then, in that brief moment, whether she would be safe continuing on alone with her child, whether the man she had warned us about might redirect his attention back toward her instead of us once she was out of sight. Once she was gone, the three of us looked at each other, and I remember the shift in the air between us immediately. The way our earlier laughter and lightness drained out almost instantly, replaced by something colder and more alert. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a group of friends when fear arrives uninvited, a silence heavier than any ordinary quiet, thick with unspoken questions none of us quite knew how to voice out loud. We looked back down the hill toward the bench where the man was still standing. He hadn't moved. He was still positioned there, still facing generally in our direction. Though from that distance and in that lighting it was impossible to make out any details of his face or expression. Just a shape, still and patient, watching. We debated quietly among ourselves what to do. Some part of each of us wanted to dismiss the whole thing, to convince ourselves that the woman had simply been overly cautious, that the man was probably just someone out for an evening walk who happened to be resting near a bench, that there was nothing actually sinister happening at all. But another part of us, the part that had gone quiet and alert the moment she mentioned being followed, couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was genuinely wrong. We decided, eventually, that we should head back toward the fairgrounds, back toward the lights and the crowds and the safety of being surrounded by hundreds of other people. It felt like the sensible choice, the obvious choice, really, once we actually stopped to think clearly about our situation, instead of continuing to enjoy our little rebellious escape from the noise of the fair. We stood up from the mouth of the tunnel and started making our way back down the trail, walking quickly now, our earlier carefree pace replaced by something far more purposeful. None of us said much as we walked, each of us apparently lost in our own private calculations about distance, about how far we still had to go before reaching safety, about whether the man was still somewhere nearby watching our every move. I remember glancing back down toward the bench as we started moving, and my stomach dropped when I saw that the man was gone. Not walking away in some visible direction, not repositioning himself somewhere else along the trail that we could track with our eyes. Simply gone. The bench empty. The space around it holding nothing but shadow, and the faint outline of trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. I remember grabbing my friend's arm the instant I noticed, whispering to the other two that he had disappeared, and watching both of their faces shift in the dim light as the same realization hit them. That particular tightening around the eyes that comes with genuine fear rather than simple nervousness. We picked up our pace immediately after that, walking faster, none of us saying much of anything now. All three of us scanning the darkness around the trail as we moved, trying to spot any sign of him, any indication of where he might have gone, or whether he was somewhere nearby watching us continue on our way. The trail felt longer on the way back than it had on the way out. Every shadow between the widely spaced lampposts seeming to stretch and shift in ways that made my heart pound harder with every step. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound carried faintly on the evening breeze, seemed suddenly loaded with possible threat, and I found myself flinching at noises I would have ignored completely under any other circumstances. At one point, one of my friends grabbed my arm hard enough that I actually gasped and pointed toward a cluster of trees just off the trail to our left. I looked, and for just a moment, barely long enough to be certain of what I was seeing, I thought I saw a shape standing among the trunks, still and watching, roughly the same size and stillness as the man we had seen near the bench. By the time I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there, just trees and shadow and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. We didn't stop to investigate. We didn't discuss whether it had actually been him or just our nerves playing tricks on us in the darkness. We simply walked faster, practically jogging now, until the lights and noise of the fairgrounds finally came back into view ahead of us. I don't think I have ever felt as much relief in my life as I did in that moment. Seeing the bright lights of the rides, hearing the music and the laughter, and the general chaotic noise of hundreds of people gathered together in one place. We practically ran the last stretch of trail, bursting back out into the crowd, immediately surrounding ourselves with people, with families, with the comforting anonymity of a busy public event. We found a bench near one of the food stands and sat down, all three of us breathing hard. None of us saying much of anything for a good few minutes while we simply tried to process what had just happened. My hands, I remember distinctly, were shaking slightly, and it took a while for that shaking to fully settle, even surrounded by all that noise and light and ordinary fair chaos that just an hour earlier had felt boring and beneath us. We talked about it eventually, quietly, huddled close together on that bench while the fair continued around us, oblivious to what we had just experienced. We went over every detail we could remember. The way the woman had approached us, the careful, urgent way she had delivered her warning, the way the man had simply stood there at the bottom of the hill, silent and watching, and the way he had vanished so completely from that spot the moment we decided to leave. None of us had a good explanation for any of it, and none of us particularly wanted to go back and investigate further, even out of simple curiosity. One of my friends kept glancing back toward the trail entrance every few minutes, as though half expecting to see the man emerge from it and walk calmly into the crowd toward us. And I found myself doing the same thing more than once, unable to fully shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of him that night. We ended up calling one of our parents to come pick us up early that night, cutting our evening at the fair short, despite how much we had originally been looking forward to it. I remember sitting in the back seat of the car on the drive home, staring out the window at the darkened streets passing by, still feeling that lingering unease from the trail, still turning the whole encounter over in my mind, trying to make sense of what exactly we had experienced and how close we might have actually come to real danger that night. None of us told our parents the full details that night, not right away. It took a few days before I finally worked up the nerve to explain everything to my mother, and I remember the way her face changed as I described it, the particular alarm that crossed her expression when I mentioned the man vanishing so suddenly from the bench. In the years since, I have thought about that encounter more times than I probably should, examining it from every possible angle, trying to decide what it actually meant. Was the man genuinely following us with some dangerous intention? Someone who had been tracking our movements from a distance, waiting for the right moment or the right isolated stretch of trail to act on whatever he was planning? Or was there some more innocent explanation, some misunderstanding that the woman had simply misread, mistaking an ordinary stranger's presence for something more sinister than it actually was? I have never been able to settle on an answer that feels fully satisfying, no matter how many times I have replayed that evening in my mind over the years. Part of what makes the memory so unsettling, even now, is the fact that we will genuinely never know. We never saw that man again. At least, not that we recognized. Not in any context that would have let us confirm or deny our suspicions about that night. We never learned anything more about the woman who warned us either. Never saw her again at any subsequent fair or anywhere else in town. This stranger who had gone out of her way, with a baby in her arms no less, to climb a dark hill and warned 3 teenage girls she had never met about a danger she had noticed and we hadn't. What stays with me most, looking back on it as an adult now, is just how vulnerable we actually were in that moment, and how little we understood that vulnerability at the time. 14-year-old girls, alone on a poorly lit trail, tucked into a secluded spot at the top of a hill, completely unaware of how isolated and exposed we had made ourselves simply by wanting to feel independent for one evening. If that woman hadn't happened to notice the man following her, hadn't happened to have the courage and the concern to climb up and warn us directly, I genuinely don't know how that night might have unfolded differently. It is a thought that still makes my chest tighten slightly whenever I let myself sit with it for too long, even now, so many years removed from that single frightening evening. I have told this story to people over the years, and reactions tend to vary quite a bit depending on who I'm talking to. Some people focus on the mundane possible explanations, suggesting the man was simply out for an evening walk and happened to pause near a bench, that our fear and the woman's warning combined to create a sense of danger that may not have actually existed in any concrete way. Others take it far more seriously, pointing out that a stranger doesn't typically go out of her way, especially while caring for an infant, to deliver a warning like that unless she genuinely believed something dangerous was happening. I tend to fall into the second camp myself, though I recognize I am not exactly an unbiased judge of the situation, having lived through the fear of that night firsthand. What I keep coming back to, more than any specific detail of the man himself or his exact intentions, is the moment he disappeared from that bench. There was nowhere for him to go that quickly, no clear direction he could have moved in that would have taken him out of sight so completely and so suddenly in the short span of time it took us to stand up and start walking. The trail stretched in both directions with enough visibility, even in that poor lighting, that we should have been able to spot him moving away in either direction. And yet when I looked back down that hill, he was simply gone, as though he had never been standing there at all, leaving only the empty bench and the deepening shadows of the evening behind him. I still think about that possible glimpse among the trees, too. That brief, uncertain flash of a shape that may or may not have been him, watching us from somewhere just off the trail as we hurried back toward the safety of the fairgrounds. I have never been fully certain whether that was real, whether we genuinely saw him tracking our retreat from a slightly different vantage point, or whether our nerves and our fear simply conjured a shape out of ordinary shadows and swaying branches. Fear does strange things to perception, and I am honest enough with myself to admit that possibility exists. But the uncertainty itself has never brought me any comfort. If anything, not knowing for certain makes the memory sit heavier than it might if I had a clear, definitive answer either way. My friends and I have talked about that night many times over the years since. Even now as adults scattered in different parts of the country, still occasionally bringing it up when old memories from our teenage years come up in conversation. We all remember it the same way. All three of us carrying the same core details, the same lingering unease, the same gratitude toward a stranger who took the time to warn us about a danger we hadn't even noticed ourselves. None of us have ever been able to shake the feeling that something genuinely threatening was unfolding that evening, something we managed to avoid only because of one woman's courage and quick thinking. One of my friends, the one who first spotted that possible shape among the trees on our way back, has said more than once that she thinks about that night whenever she reads news stories about young girls going missing or being harmed by strangers who had apparently been watching and waiting for the right opportunity. She says it makes that abstract kind of danger feel suddenly very real and very close, a reminder that the difference between an ordinary evening and a genuine tragedy can sometimes come down to nothing more than one stranger's willingness to speak up, one small warning delivered at exactly the right moment. I think about it in similar terms myself, though I try not to dwell on it too heavily, not wanting to let that single frightening evening color every walk in every park for the rest of my life. Still, there are nights even now, decades later, when I find myself thinking of that hill, that tunnel, that empty bench, and I feel the same small chill creep up my spine that I felt the very first time I looked down and realized he was gone. We have wondered, too, over the years, what became of the woman who warned us. She never gave us her name, never lingered long enough after her warning for us to properly thank her or ask any further questions before she continued on her own way with her baby. I think about her sometimes. Wonder if she made it home safely that night. Wonder if the man had been following her specifically before he apparently shifted his attention toward the three of us sitting alone at the mouth of that tunnel. I hope, whoever she was, that she is doing well, that her life has been safe and uneventful since that particular evening, and that she has some sense, even if she never learned the full outcome, of just how much her small act of courage may have mattered to three teenage girls she encountered only once and never saw again. It remains one of those strange, quiet mysteries from my adolescence. A stranger who appeared exactly when we needed her most, and then simply walked on into the darkness, never to be seen or identified again. I don't walk on poorly lit trails alone anymore, not since that night. And I doubt I ever will again, regardless of how many years pass or how far removed I become from that particular memory. There is a lesson in it, I suppose, about vulnerability and awareness, about how quickly an ordinary evening can shift into something far more dangerous without any clear warning beyond the instincts of a stranger who happened to notice what we had somehow missed entirely. But mostly, when I think back on that night now, I don't think about lessons or safety advice. I think about that empty bench at the bottom of the hill, and the particular kind of cold that settled into my chest the instant I realized the man who had been watching us was no longer anywhere to be seen. A cold that, honestly, has never fully left me since. My uncle passed away from brain cancer, but before that happened, my mom and I spent a long stretch of time helping take care of him as his illness slowly took more and more from him. I was not yet a teenager during that period, still young enough that I didn't fully understand everything that was happening around me, but old enough to notice things, to absorb the emotional weight hanging over my mother even when she tried her best to hide it from me. I remember watching her face during those visits, catching the exhaustion and sadness she carried underneath her usual calm exterior, and even though I couldn't articulate it at that age, I understood on some level that something painful was unfolding right in front of me. Looking back, I think children are often far more perceptive than adults give them credit for, able to sense tension and grief even when nobody explains the details directly, simply by watching the small shifts in expression and tone that happen around them. The brain cancer did more than just physically weaken him. It changed who he was, slowly stripping away the personality my mom had known her entire life and replacing it with something harder to recognize, something unpredictable and often cruel. The dementia that came along with his illness turned him into someone almost unrecognizable compared to the uncle I had grown up around, and watching that transformation happen was confusing and upsetting for a kid my age, even though I only saw a fraction of what my mother had to deal with directly. I remember the drives to his house, the way my mother's posture would change the closer we got, a kind of bracing, quiet tension settling into her shoulders as she prepared herself for whatever version of him we might encounter that particular day. Some visits were manageable, even pleasant in brief stretches, while others were exhausting and emotionally draining almost from the moment we walked through his front door. He became genuinely difficult to be around, especially toward my mom. He would say things to her that were shockingly harsh, things that felt completely out of character for the relationship I remembered them having. I distinctly recall him calling her stupid over something as small as not stacking his papers the exact way he wanted them stacked, his voice rising with an anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor mistake had supposedly triggered it. Other times, he would suddenly accuse her of stealing his cups, insisting that dozens of them had gone missing from his kitchen, even though nothing had actually disappeared at all. It felt like roughly half of what came out of his mouth during those difficult months was rooted in some kind of real frustration or confusion caused by the illness, while the other half seemed to arrive completely out of nowhere, untethered from anything that had actually happened, as though his mind was simply generating grievances on its own, without any connection to reality. Watching my mother absorb all of that anger and confusion made me deeply uncomfortable as a child. I didn't fully understand what dementia was at that age, didn't have the vocabulary or the life experience to process why someone I loved was suddenly being so unkind to my own mother. Someone who was doing nothing but showing up day after day to help him, patiently, without complaint, no matter how difficult those visits became. I just knew it felt wrong, felt heavy in a way that settled uncomfortably in my chest every time I witnessed one of those outbursts, and I remember wishing, in that simple, wordless way children wish for things, that he would just go back to being the uncle I remembered from before. What made the whole situation even more confusing for me was the contrast between what I was witnessing during his illness and what I remembered from years earlier. My mom and my uncle had always had a genuinely good relationship growing up, the kind of warm, easy sibling bond that made family gatherings comfortable and pleasant. I had memories from maybe a decade before his diagnosis of the two of them laughing together, teasing each other the way siblings do, clearly enjoying each other's company in a way that felt completely natural and unforced. I remember holidays where he would show up with some ridiculous joke prepared just to make my mom laugh. The kind of easy affection that only exists between people who have known each other since childhood and never lost that closeness along the way. Trying to reconcile those older, happier memories with the harsh, unpredictable man he had become during his illness was genuinely difficult for me as a child. It felt like I was watching two entirely different people, and I struggled to understand how someone could change so completely, even though I now understand, as an adult, exactly how brain cancer and the dementia it can cause are capable of reshaping a person's behavior and personality in ways that have nothing to do with who they actually are underneath the illness. He eventually passed away, and in the aftermath of losing him, our family moved through the usual stages of grief, the funeral, the condolences, the slow process of adjusting to his absence. I remember the funeral itself only in fragments now, the way memories from that particular period tend to blur together, but I do remember my mother's face during the service, a complicated mixture of grief and something that almost looked like relief, an expression I didn't fully understand at the time, but recognize now as the natural response of someone who has spent months watching a loved one suffer through a difficult, undignified decline. Life continued on in the way it does after loss, the sharp edges of grief gradually softening over time, even though the loss itself never fully disappears. About a year passed after his death, life settling into whatever new normal exists after losing someone close to you, when something happened that none of us were prepared for. Something that still gives me chills whenever I think back on it now. all these years later. We came home one evening, nothing unusual about the day leading up to it, and noticed the small red light on our answering machine blinking, indicating we had messages waiting. This was back when answering machines still used those tiny cassette tapes, the kind that clicked and whirred as they played back recorded messages. Technology that feels almost impossibly outdated now, but was completely ordinary at the time. I remember the specific sound of that machine, the little mechanical clunk as it engaged, the faint hiss of tape before any actual voice came through the speaker, sounds so ordinary and familiar that we barely registered them consciously most of the time. We pressed play, expecting the usual assortment of messages, maybe a call from a relative, maybe something related to school or work, nothing out of the ordinary. The first message that played was one we had actually heard before, an older recording that must have simply stayed saved on the tape for whatever reason. Something familiar enough that we didn't think much of it in the moment. It was my uncle's voice, though I don't remember the exact content of that particular message anymore. Just the recognition of hearing him again, a small jolt of familiarity, mixed with the lingering sadness that came with hearing someone who was no longer alive. We had heard that specific message before, so we didn't dwell on it, assuming it was simply an old recording that had somehow never been deleted, one of those small artifacts of a life that linger on in unexpected places long after someone is gone. Then the second message began to play. And this one none of us had ever heard before. It was him again, unmistakably my uncle's voice, but the content of this particular message was completely unfamiliar to all of us. He was apologizing directly to my mother, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Not during those difficult months of his illness, when his voice had so often been sharp and accusatory, but something softer, something that sounded genuinely remorseful. I remember the specific phrase that stuck with me most clearly from that message. Him saying something along the lines of, I shouldn't have said that earlier, his voice trailing with what sounded like real regret. There was a pause in the recording after that line, a stretch of quiet that felt heavier than ordinary silence, as though he was gathering himself, choosing his next words carefully before continuing. Based on the wording, based on that specific reference to something he shouldn't have said earlier, we quickly realized this message must have been recorded sometime after one of those difficult visits. One of the times during his illness when he had lashed out at my mother the way he so often did during that period, only for him to apparently call afterward, once alone, to leave this quiet, private apology on our answering machine. A private moment of remorse that none of us had ever known existed until we heard it playing back to us, a full year after his death, sitting together in stunned silence as his words filled the room. I remember the feeling that settled over the room as that message played, the way the air seemed to shift, growing heavier and colder despite nothing physically changing around us. My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion first, then something closer to shock, and finally something deeply emotional that I couldn't fully name at the time but now understand was probably some complicated mixture of grief, relief, and disbelief, all tangled together at once, all crossing her features within the span of just a few seconds. Hearing an apology like that, especially one we never knew existed, especially one arriving a full year after his passing, felt profoundly strange in a way that went beyond ordinary sentimentality. It felt like receiving a message from beyond, even though logically we understood it had to be an old recording that had simply never played back to us before that particular evening. The chilling part, the part that has stayed with me most vividly over the years since, wasn't just the content of the apology itself. though that alone carried significant emotional weight given everything my mother had endured during his illness. It was the timing, the sheer unlikeliness of it all. Why had that message never played before? Why had it apparently remained hidden on that tape, unheard and unknown to us, for an entire year after his death, only to suddenly surface on that particular evening when we walked in and noticed the blinking light waiting for us? I tried for a long time afterward to find some kind of logical explanation for the timing of it all. I wondered if maybe there was some technical malfunction with the answering machine itself, some glitch in the recording or playback mechanism that could explain why a message would remain unplayed and seemingly undetected for such an extended period before finally appearing. I considered whether perhaps the tape itself had simply been overlooked somehow, whether we had simply failed to notice the blinking light for an entire year, though that explanation never felt fully satisfying to me, given how frequently we used that answering machine and how unlikely it seemed that a blinking indicator light could go unnoticed for so long in a household that checked it regularly. I even asked around at one point whether other families who had used similar machines had ever experienced anything comparable. Messages resurfacing unexpectedly after long stretches of apparent silence. And while a few people mentioned vague, unrelated stories about old technology behaving strangely, nobody offered anything that felt like a genuine parallel to what we had experienced. I also tried looking for any kind of meaningful date correlation, wondering if the day we discovered that message lined up with anything significant, maybe an anniversary of some kind. Maybe a date that held particular emotional significance related to my uncle or to that specific apology. I checked the calendar carefully once I was old enough to think to do so, cross-referencing the date of his death, the date of his funeral, even the approximate date of that specific difficult visit he seemed to be apologizing for, trying to find some thread connecting all of it together into something that made logical sense. I never found anything concrete. No obvious anniversary, no clear explanation that would account for why that message chose that particular evening, a year after his death, to finally reveal itself to us. It remains, to this day, one of those unresolved mysteries from my childhood, a small, unexplainable detail that refuses to fit neatly into any rational framework I have tried to build around it, no matter how many angles I have approached it from over the years. What I do know with complete certainty is how it felt in that moment, standing in our living room, listening to my deceased uncle's voice apologizing to my mother for something cruel he had said during his illness, a message we had never heard before, surfacing exactly 1 year after he had passed away. There was something in the timing, something in the specificity of the apology itself, that felt less like a coincidence and more like something my uncle, in whatever way remained accessible to him after death, wanted my mother to finally hear, as though he had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to let those words reach her. My mother has never fully explained to me what that message meant to her emotionally, not in any deep, detailed way. She has mentioned it briefly over the years, always with a certain quiet reflectiveness in her voice, but she has never wanted to dwell on it extensively, and I have learned out of respect for her not to push the subject too hard when it comes up. There have been a handful of occasions, usually late at night during longer conversations, when old memories surface more freely than usual, where she has come close to opening up about it further, only to catch herself and steer the conversation elsewhere, as though even now, so many years later, the memory still carries more weight than she feels ready to fully unpack out loud. What I do understand, even without her spelling it out explicitly, is that hearing that apology likely provided her with some measure of closure she hadn't realized she needed. A confirmation that underneath all the harsh words and confused accusations that defined so much of his final months some part of my uncle remained aware enough and caring enough to recognize when he had hurt her and to feel genuine remorse about it, even if he could only express that remorse privately into an answering machine rather than directly to her face in the moment. I think about that period of my childhood often, the confusing mixture of love and pain that defined those months of caring for my uncle through his illness. I think about watching my mother absorb so much unwarranted anger and cruelty from someone she loved deeply, someone whose personality had been so completely reshaped by the disease attacking his brain that he had become almost unrecognizable during his worst moments. And I think, especially, about that evening a year after his death, standing in our living room, listening to a message that shouldn't have still existed unheard on that tape, hearing his voice apologize for something he had said months earlier, the timing of its discovery still unexplained to this day. A small, unsolved mystery that has quietly followed me through every year since. I have wondered, in the years since, whether there was something more at work in that moment than simple technical coincidence. Whether my uncle, in whatever way consciousness or awareness might persist after death, found some way to ensure that apology finally reached my mother when she needed to hear it most, rather than simply being lost forever on an old cassette tape inside a forgotten answering machine. I don't have any concrete way to prove that theory, no evidence beyond the simple, unsettling fact of the timing itself, but it is a thought that has stayed with me nonetheless, offering a strange kind of comfort even amid the chill that memory still produces whenever I let myself think about it too closely. I have never been someone who believed strongly in an afterlife or in spirits reaching back into the world of the living, but that particular evening remains the one experience in my life that has ever come close to shaking that skepticism, planting a small, persistent seed of doubt that I have never quite been able to fully dismiss, no matter how many years pass. My mother eventually got rid of that answering machine, along with a small collection of cassette tapes that had accumulated inside it over the years. I don't know if she deliberately chose to dispose of it because of that particular message, or if it was simply part of the natural process of upgrading to newer technology as the years passed and answering machines became increasingly obsolete. I never asked her directly, sensing that it might be a sensitive subject better left unexplored, and she never offered an explanation on her own. I remember noticing, sometime later, that the machine had simply vanished from its usual spot on the kitchen counter, replaced eventually by a newer phone system that recorded messages digitally instead, and I remember feeling a small, strange pang of loss at its absence, as though some tangible connection to that unexplainable evening had quietly disappeared along with it. Whatever her reasoning, that particular device, along with whatever other messages might have remained recorded on those small tapes, is long gone now, existing only in memory rather than as any kind of physical evidence I could revisit or examine more closely. Sometimes, even now as an adult, I find myself thinking about that evening, about the specific sound of my uncle's voice coming through that small speaker, apologizing for cruelty that had clearly weighed on him even in his confused, illness-addled state. I think about the particular chill that settled over the room as we all realized what we were hearing. The way something so small and ordinary as an answering machine message could carry such profound emotional and unexplainable weight. I think, too, about how strange it is that a voice can outlast a body, how a small plastic cassette could hold on to a fragment of someone long after everything else about them has changed or disappeared, preserved in a way that feels almost too intimate, too raw, for something as mundane as home answering machine technology. I have never found a satisfying answer for why that message surfaced when it did, a full year after his passing, and honestly, at this point, I am not sure I actually want one. Some mysteries, I have come to believe, are better left exactly as they are, unexplained and slightly unsettling, existing as a strange, tender reminder that even the people who hurt us most during their darkest moments often carry regret and love for us underneath everything else. Regret that sometimes finds its way to the surface in the strangest, most unexpected ways imaginable. Long after we assume the opportunity for such things has already passed us by completely. Looking back now with the added perspective that comes from growing older and understanding illness in a way I couldn't at that age, I recognize just how much my mother sacrificed during those months of caring for my uncle. She showed up for him consistently, despite the harsh words, despite the confusion and unpredictability that had become such a defining feature of his personality during his final year of life. She absorbed accusations that made no sense, insults that had nothing to do with anything she had actually done, and she kept coming back anyway, driven by love and loyalty toward a brother she had known and cared about for her entire life before illness reshaped him into someone so much harder to recognize. I think about the countless small moments of patience she must have shown that I never even witnessed, the quiet strength required to keep returning to a situation that offered her so little in the way of gratitude or kindness during those difficult final months. That message arriving so mysteriously, a full year after his death, feels in some ways like a small acknowledgement of everything she endured during that period, a final confirmation that the uncle she had always known and loved was still present somewhere underneath the illness, even during his cruelest moments, aware enough on some level to recognize his own harshness and to genuinely regret it once the immediate confusion of the moment had passed. Whether that message reached us through some strange technical glitch or through something far less explainable, I choose to believe it arrived exactly when it needed to, offering my mother a small, unexpected gift of closure precisely 1 year after she had lost her brother to an illness that had taken so much from both of them long before it finally took his life completely. And whenever I think back on that evening now, the blinking light on that old machine, the crackle of the tape, the sound of his voice apologizing across the distance of a full year, I still feel that same small chill settle over me. A reminder that some things in this life simply refuse to be fully explained, no matter how hard we search for the answers. I have carried that memory with me through the years since, turning it over in my mind during quiet moments when old family stories come back to the surface unprompted. There is something profoundly strange about technology holding on to a voice long after the person behind it has passed away. Something that blurs the line between ordinary explanation and something closer to the unexplainable. Cassette tapes, unlike digital recordings, have a physical, tangible quality to them, a sense of actually holding a piece of recorded time within their small plastic bodies. Knowing that his voice remained trapped there, unheard, for an entire year before finally surfacing exactly when it did, has never stopped feeling significant to me, regardless of how many rational explanations I have tried to apply to it over time. Even now, describing it to someone new, I notice how the story tends to land differently depending on who is listening. Some people immediately reach for practical explanations, suggesting some mechanical quirk in the machine itself, some reasonable technical cause I simply haven't considered. Others go quiet in the way people do when a story unsettles them slightly, sitting with the strangeness of it rather than rushing to resolve it. I understand both reactions completely. And honestly, I have moved through both of those responses myself at different points over the years, sometimes searching hard for a logical answer, and other times simply allowing the mystery to remain exactly as unresolved as it has always been. I have shared this story with only a small handful of people over the years, Mostly close friends who I trusted to listen without dismissing it outright, and I have noticed that the ones who take it most seriously tend to be people who have lost someone themselves. People who understand, on some deep and personal level, just how much weight a single unexpected message from beyond can carry, regardless of whether it arrives through ordinary technology or something far stranger. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I got sick one day and had to stay home from school. Both of my parents worked full-time jobs, and neither of them could get the day off on such short notice, so after a lot of back and forth that morning, deliberating over whether to call in a favor with a relative or simply take the risk, they decided the safest option was simply to leave me at home by myself for the day. Before they left, they gave me all the usual instructions parents give a child in that situation. Stay inside the house, do not answer the door for anyone, no matter who it is or what they say, and be careful of strangers in general. It was the kind of talk I had heard variations of many times before. The standard warnings every kid gets at some point, and at that age I honestly didn't think much of it. I just nodded along, more focused on the fact that I felt miserable and just wanted to lie around and watch television for the day, my head aching and my stomach unsettled in the particular way that makes a child just want to disappear into a blanket on the sofa for as long as possible. Our house was an old Victorian building made of sandstone, the kind of solid, heavy structure that made up a lot of the older homes in our area, with thick walls and tall windows that gave every room a certain dignified, old-fashioned feel. It had been in the family for a while by that point, passed down through some combination of purchase and inheritance that I never fully understood as a child. And it always carried that particular atmosphere older houses often have, a mixture of comfort and quiet grandeur, solid in a way that newer houses somehow never quite managed to replicate. The front room, where I spent most of that morning curled up on the sofa, had a large bay window that looked directly out onto the street. We lived on a fairly busy main road, with a row of shops lining the opposite side, so there was a more or less constant flow of people walking past throughout the day, going in and out of the shops, waiting at the bus stop further down, just going about their ordinary business without any particular reason to notice our house at all. I remember feeling a bit self-conscious, sitting there in my pajamas with the television on, fully visible to anyone who happened to glance toward our window as they walked by. It felt strange being so exposed to the street while I was homesick and clearly not going anywhere, so at some point during the morning, I got up and pulled the curtains partially closed, leaving just enough of a gap that I could still see out onto the street and still get some natural light into the room, without feeling quite so watched by passing strangers. It was right as I was adjusting the curtains that I first noticed him. A man, probably somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, walking along the pavement on the opposite side of the road. He had a beard, wore glasses, and was dressed in a green knitted jumper. The kind of outfit that, looking back now, fit almost exactly the stereotype you might picture if someone asked you to describe what a dangerous stranger looks like in the abstract. The sort of image that gets passed around in cautionary stories aimed at children. There was nothing specific I could point to about him in that first moment, no obvious threat or aggressive behavior, but something about the way he carried himself. Something about the particular quality of his presence on that ordinary street struck me as slightly off in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I remember watching him for a few seconds through the gap in the curtains before he continued on and disappeared from view, and then I mostly forgot about him, going back to my show, still feeling too unwell to spend much energy thinking about a random passerby. About 10 minutes later, though, I noticed him again. Same man, same green jumper, walking in the exact same direction as before, along the same stretch of pavement across from our house. It struck me as odd immediately, the kind of small detail that snags your attention even before your conscious mind fully processes why. If he had simply been out for a walk originally, heading somewhere with a normal destination in mind, there wouldn't have been an obvious reason for him to be walking that same direction again so soon, unless he had looped all the way around the block and come back to walk past our house a second time. That thought settled into my stomach with a small, uncomfortable weight, though I still wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. I told myself it was probably nothing, that adults sometimes walk in circles for exercise or simply lost track of where they were going. All the small rationalizations a child reaches for when trying to talk themselves out of an instinct that something isn't right. 10 minutes after that, he appeared a third time. This time, though, he didn't simply continue walking past our house the way he had the previous 2 times. He stopped right at the edge of our driveway, standing there for what felt like a very long stretch of time, though it was probably only around 30 seconds in reality, just looking directly at our front window. I remember freezing completely still on the sofa, my heart suddenly pounding in a way it hadn't been just moments before, watching him through the narrow gap in the curtains, watching him watch our house, and feeling with absolute certainty that something was very wrong. After that pause at the edge of the driveway, he started walking toward our front door, and as he approached, he turned his head to look directly into the window as he passed it, his eyes scanning the room in a way that made my skin crawl even through the glass and the narrow gap in the curtains separating us. Thankfully, our house had thick, heavy storm doors on the front, old-fashioned security doors that required a key to open from the outside, a detail of our old Victorian home that had never seemed particularly significant to me before that moment, but which suddenly felt like the most important thing in the entire world. He couldn't get through those doors without a key, and for a brief second, I allowed myself a small flicker of relief at that realization. That relief didn't last long. He began knocking on the door, first a few careful, testing knocks, and then progressively firmer ones as no response came. Every instinct in me was screaming to stay completely silent, to not move, to not make a single sound that might draw his attention any further. And despite being only 10 or 11 years old, despite every part of me being terrified, something deep and instinctive told me clearly and firmly that answering that door or making any noise at all would be a serious mistake. I stayed exactly where I was, frozen on the sofa, barely breathing, watching the door through the gap in the curtains as the knocking continued. When the knocking stopped receiving any response, he moved to the window instead, coming right up to the glass and beginning to bang on it with his hand, saying something to me through the glass that I genuinely couldn't make out clearly, his voice muffled and distorted by the thick old window and the fear pounding through my own ears at that point, drowning out most other sound. I remember catching only fragments of whatever he was saying, disconnected syllables that didn't form any coherent sentence I could understand, though the tone of it was unmistakably urgent, insistent, the voice of someone trying very hard to get me to open that door or window for him. And then I watched something shift across his face, a change in his expression that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was the look of someone who had just remembered something important, a small flicker of calculation crossing his features as he seemed to realize, or recall, that there might be another way into the house. I understood immediately, with a fresh surge of pure terror, exactly what he had just thought of. Our back door. My parents never locked it during the day, keeping it accessible so our family dog could go in and out into the garden as he pleased throughout the day while they were both away at work. That door had always felt like a completely harmless, ordinary convenience before that moment. Suddenly, it felt like the single most dangerous vulnerability in our entire house. I didn't wait to see if he actually started moving toward the back of the house. I bolted from the sofa the instant I saw that realization cross his face. Running as fast as my legs could carry me through the hallway and into the kitchen, my whole body flooded with adrenaline in a way I had never experienced before in my young life. I reached the back door, grabbed the key that was thankfully still sitting in the lock where it always stayed, and turned it as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. I locked that door with, I later realized, only seconds to spare. Almost immediately after I heard the click of the lock engaging, I watched the door handle begin to turn from the outside, someone trying to open it, only to find it now securely locked against them. And then the banging started again, this time on the back door itself, loud and insistent, the sound of a grown man's fist hitting solid wood over and over, the whole door seeming to shudder slightly with each impact. I don't remember consciously deciding what to do next. My body simply reacted on its own, dropping down to the kitchen floor and curling into as small a ball as I could manage, tucked into the corner near the cupboards, as far from both doors as I could physically get within that small space. I stayed there, shaking, crying silently, listening to the sound of him moving around outside our house, trying different windows now, testing each one methodically to see if any had been left unlocked or unlatched somewhere along the way. Those 30 minutes that followed were, without exaggeration, the most terrifying 30 minutes of my entire childhood. I have no clear memory of exact time passing in any structured way, only a blur of fear, of listening intently to every sound coming from outside, trying to track his movement around the perimeter of the house based purely on the noise of him testing each window in turn, praying silently and repeatedly that my parents had actually locked every single one before they left for work that morning, that there wasn't some overlooked gap somewhere that would allow him inside, despite everything. I remember counting my own breaths at one point, trying to steady myself, trying to keep from making any sound that might carry through the walls and give away exactly where inside the house I was hiding. Every creak of the old floorboards beneath me felt impossibly loud in that moment, every small shift of my own weight against the tile, threatening to betray my position to whoever was circling outside. I remember at one point hearing him move to a window on the side of the house, one that looked into a small side room we rarely used, and the sound of him rattling the frame, testing whether it might give way, sent a fresh wave of panic through me, even though I was nowhere near that particular window myself. I kept expecting, with each new sound, that this would finally be the moment he found a way inside, that all my efforts locking the back door would turn out to have been for nothing, because some other point of entry had been left vulnerable without my knowledge. That uncertainty, more than almost anything else, is what made those 30 minutes stretch on so unbearably, not knowing for certain whether I was actually safe or simply waiting for the inevitable. Eventually, after what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time curled up on that kitchen floor, the sounds stopped. No more banging, no more window testing, no more indication that he was still anywhere nearby. I stayed exactly where I was for a long while afterward, regardless, too frightened to move, too uncertain whether he had genuinely left or was simply waiting somewhere out of sight, testing my nerve, hoping I might eventually come out from hiding and give him another opportunity. I don't know exactly how much additional time passed before I finally worked up the courage to move from that spot on the kitchen floor, my limbs stiff and my whole body still trembling from the adrenaline that had flooded through me over the previous half hour. When I eventually did, cautiously, carefully, checking each window from a safe distance before approaching, there was no sign of him anywhere. The street outside looked completely ordinary again, people walking past our house exactly the way they had earlier that morning, seemingly with no awareness whatsoever of what had just happened inside our home. I called my mother at work as soon as I felt able to speak clearly enough to explain what had happened. I remember my voice shaking uncontrollably as I tried to describe everything. The man in the green jumper, the way he had looped around multiple times before finally stopping, the knocking, the banging, the way he had tried every window and door around our house for a solid half hour while I hid on the kitchen floor, terrified beyond anything I had ever experienced before in my young life. I could hear the panic rising in her own voice as I spoke, the way she immediately switched into a kind of urgent, focused mode, asking rapid questions about whether I was safe now, whether he was still anywhere nearby, whether I had locked every door properly. She came home immediately, and my father followed shortly after, both of them clearly badly shaken by what I told them. And we ended up calling the police to report the incident properly, giving them as detailed a description of the man as I could manage in my still shaken state. The police officers who came to the house that afternoon were kind and patient with me, asking careful questions about what I had seen, what he had looked like, what direction he had come from, and gone in each time he passed our house. I remember struggling to answer some of their questions with the kind of precision they seemed to want, my memory of the exact sequence of events already starting to blur slightly under the weight of everything I had just experienced. Adrenaline and fear making it hard to keep every detail perfectly straight in my mind. They walked around the outside of our house afterward, checking each window he had apparently tried, noting the details for their report, though I don't remember them finding any physical evidence beyond a few scuff marks near one of the side windows where he had clearly pushed and pulled at the frame trying to force it open. Nothing ever came of the police report, as far as I know. No arrest, no follow-up, no resolution that ever reached me directly as a child. Though I imagine there may have been more investigation happening behind the scenes than I was ever made aware of at that age. I never saw that man again, not walking past our house, not anywhere else in town, though for years afterward I remained hyper-alert to any man matching his general description. That particular combination of beard, glasses, and build settling permanently into some deep, watchful corner of my memory. I dread to think, even now as an adult, looking back on that day, what might have happened if I hadn't remembered that our back door was unlocked in time. If I had been even a few seconds slower reaching that lock, or if I had frozen instead of moving the instant I saw that shift in his expression at the front window. It is a thought I have returned to many times over the years, turning it over carefully, trying to imagine how differently that day could have unfolded with just the smallest change in timing or reaction on my part. I was a sick, frightened 10-year-old home alone, and the only thing that stood between me and whatever that man's intentions actually were was a simple metal lock that I happened to remember and reach in time. A margin so thin it still unsettles me to consider it properly. My parents never left me home alone again after that. Not for a very long time afterward, and even once they eventually resumed doing so as I got a bit older, there were new rules, new precautions, an entirely different level of caution built into how they approached the situation compared to before. New locks were fitted on every window within days of the incident, and my mother insisted for years afterward that the back door remain locked at all times, even during the day, arranging a small flap for the dog to use instead so the door itself could stay secure regardless of who happened to be home. I understand now, as an adult myself, just how frightened they must have been in the aftermath of that call. How much guilt they likely carried over having left me alone that particular day, even though there was truly no way for them to have anticipated what would happen. No reasonable way to have predicted that a stranger would target our house so deliberately on the one day I happened to be home, sick, and unsupervised. I think about that day often, more than I probably should, given how many years have passed since it happened. I think about the specific green of his jumper, the particular way his glasses caught the light as he pressed his face close to our front window, the sound of his fist against our back door. A sound I still sometimes hear echoed faintly in my mind whenever I'm home alone and someone knocks unexpectedly, even now, decades later, as a fully grown adult with a home and family of my own. That particular sound has never fully lost its power over me, still capable of sending a small jolt of old familiar fear through my chest before my rational mind catches up and reminds me that I am safe, that this is simply an ordinary visitor at an ordinary door. Nothing at all like that terrifying morning from my childhood. I have wondered many times over the years exactly what he wanted, what his actual intentions were that day, though I have never allowed myself to dwell too deeply on the darker possibilities, preferring instead to simply be grateful that whatever he intended never came to pass. The way he looped around the block multiple times before finally stopping suggests some level of deliberate planning, some careful assessment happening in his mind as he passed our house those first two times, watching, calculating, before finally deciding to make his approach on that third pass. That detail alone has always disturbed me more than almost anything else about the entire experience. The clear evidence that this wasn't some spontaneous, impulsive act, but something he had apparently been considering and preparing for, at least in some small way, before he ever stopped at the edge of our driveway. It makes me wonder, even now, whether he had noticed something specific that first time that told him the house might be unoccupied by adults, some detail I was too young at the time to think to hide, curtains open at an unusual hour, the television visible through the glass, some small sign that told him a child was likely home alone that day. I have told this story to people occasionally over the years, and the reaction is almost always the same immediate horror, followed quickly by the same question, asking how I possibly kept my composure well enough at that age to remember the back door and get it locked in time. Honestly, I don't have a fully satisfying answer to that question myself. I think, in moments of genuine crisis, especially as a child, something instinctive simply takes over. Some deep survival mechanism that bypasses conscious thought entirely and drives you directly toward whatever action might actually keep you safe. I certainly wasn't thinking clearly in any deliberate, reasoned way in that moment. I was simply reacting, moving on pure instinct, driven by fear more powerful than any conscious thought I could have formed at that age. My body somehow understanding exactly what needed to happen, even while my mind remained frozen in terror. That old Victorian house has stayed vivid in my memory ever since, not just as the place where I grew up, but specifically as the place where that particular morning unfolded, where a sick, frightened child managed, through some combination of instinct and pure luck, to keep a determined stranger out of the house during 30 of the longest, most terrifying minutes of an entire childhood. I don't live in that house anymore, haven't for many years now, but I still think about it sometimes, about that bay window, about the sound of knocking that once meant something so much more frightening than it ever should have, and about how differently everything could have turned out if just one small detail, one lock, one remembered fact about an unlocked back door had gone the other way that particular sick day so many years ago. I have driven past that house a handful of times as an adult, on visits back to the area to see old family friends or simply passing through on my way somewhere else. It always gives me a strange, complicated feeling, seeing the bay window from the outside now, imagining the version of myself who once sat behind those curtains, sick and frightened, watching a stranger circle closer and closer with each pass along the street. The new owners have made some changes to the exterior over the years. Different paint, a new front garden layout, small details that make it feel less entirely like the house I remember. But that bay window remains essentially unchanged, and every time I catch sight of it, I feel a small echo of that old fear rise up in my chest, even now, decades removed from that particular sick day. I sometimes wonder about the other families who have lived in that house since we moved away, whether any of them have any idea what happened there on that ordinary weekday morning so many years ago. Whether the walls themselves somehow carry any trace of that fear, the way old buildings sometimes seem to hold on to pieces of their history. Probably not, realistically. Probably it is simply an ordinary house to them now, with an ordinary bay window and an ordinary back door, no different from any other Victorian sandstone home on that street. But for me, it will always be the place where I learned, far too young, just how quickly an ordinary sick day can turn into something else entirely, and just how much can depend on remembering one small, easily overlooked detail at exactly the right moment. While I was deployed in Kosovo, my team ran a lot of night missions that required covering a great deal of ground in a short period of time so we could reach our extraction points, all while staying completely undetected by anyone in the areas we passed through. Night operations like that demand a specific kind of discipline, constant awareness of your surroundings, careful pacing, and near total silence maintained across hours of movement through unfamiliar terrain. We saw strange things out there fairly often, the kind of odd flickers and half-glimpses that come with spending so many hours moving through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. Shapes that turned out to be nothing more than branches or animals once properly investigated, sounds that had perfectly ordinary explanations once traced back to their source. But nothing ever quite matched what happened during one particular mission. An experience that still sits uneasily in my memory all these years later, refusing to soften or fade the way most old memories eventually do. We had started that mission by getting dropped off in a remote location, tasked with confirming whether shipments of mortar rounds and mines were being moved through the area, part of a broader effort to track weapons movement through territory that remained unstable and dangerous even after active conflict had officially ended. Our extraction was scheduled for before daybreak, and we needed to cover just over 17 kilometers to make it happen in time. A demanding but manageable distance, given decent terrain and good planning. The terrain wasn't too overgrown, which made movement easier than usual, and we had solid intelligence about the area going in. Detailed maps and recent reconnaissance that gave us confidence heading into the mission. The moon was either completely full or very close to it that night, bright enough to illuminate the landscape in a way that made navigation simpler, but also made staying hidden a little trickier than on darker nights, assuming we didn't run into anyone. This was shaping up to be a relatively easy night compared to some of our other missions, the kind of assignment that let us move efficiently without the added tension of expecting serious contact with hostile forces. Our team was normally just 4 men, but this particular mission gave us a good opportunity to bring some newer guys along for valuable training. So we expanded to 7 total for the night, a decision that added some complexity to our movement, but also gave us a chance to build up the newer members' experience under relatively low-risk conditions. Even with the extra numbers, we wanted to make sure we kept things tight and safe, so I took rear security, watching our back trail, while another team member, who I'll simply refer to as L, took the position just ahead of me. We had worked together enough times that we moved almost instinctively as a pair, easily able to cover the rest of the team if something unexpected happened. A level of trust and coordination built up over many previous missions together. We moved about 10 kilometers through our assigned mission area without finding anything of note, making good time along the way. At that point, we needed to start heading toward our extraction point, which sat on the far side of a fairly large hill, and then continued through territory located near a village, though not close enough to put us at serious risk of detection. We regrouped briefly, did a head count along with a check of our ammunition and supplies, and moved out again. Being rear security meant I was always the last person to start moving whenever we set off, and just as I was about to fall in behind the rest of the group, I heard a noise coming from the trees maybe 50 meters off to the side. I turned toward the sound and saw that L had noticed it too, his head already angled in that same direction, his body language shifting instantly into the same alert readiness I felt in myself. Everyone else in the group kept moving forward, since the newer guys hadn't yet developed the habit of checking back every 20 meters or so to make sure their security elements were still with them, a habit that comes with experience, but takes real time to build into instinct. We were quite literally being left behind. The most likely explanation was simply a deer moving through the underbrush, something completely ordinary given the environment we were operating in, an area known to have plenty of wildlife moving through at night, but Elle and I started moving anyway, using a two-man bounding technique to advance carefully while still watching that tree line. We kept catching that same sound as we moved, so I told Elle to push ahead and rejoin the main team while I stayed behind after our next bound, positioning myself somewhere with decent cover. He took off toward the group, and I settled into place. Watching, I heard the noise again, and then saw the trees shift slightly, about 15 meters, directly in front of me. Everything went completely still after that. I stayed exactly where I was for a full 2 minutes, staying as quiet as possible, controlling my breathing, watching my front and both sides carefully, cataloging every shadow and shape within my field of vision, ready to react instantly if whatever was out there decided to make a move. Elle and the rest of the team slowly worked their way back toward my position, planning to surround whatever it was that had apparently been following us, moving with the careful, practiced silence that came from months of operating together in similar conditions. They moved into position on either side of where I had signaled, and once everyone was set, I moved forward to check the area myself. There was nothing there. No footprints, no tracks, no broken branches, no sign whatsoever that anything had actually been present, human or animal, despite the clear sounds we had both heard and the visible movement in the trees that had prompted the entire response in the first place. The guys gave Elle and me a hard time about it afterward, ribbing us for getting spooked and left behind, all in good fun, of course. The kind of teasing that happens naturally within a close team after a moment like that, the tension of the previous few minutes dissolving quickly into laughter once it became clear there was no actual threat present. We moved out again after that brief pause. I was once more the last man in the formation, with Elle positioned between myself and the next guy ahead of him. This time, there were no strange noises as I stepped away from our brief stop, and for a while it seemed like whatever had unsettled us earlier had simply moved on, or had never actually been a genuine threat to begin with. We continued on for about another 2 kilometers before reaching an orchard that our route required us to pass through. Rows of fruit trees stretching out on either side of a narrow dirt path that cut directly through the middle of the grove. The moonlight was particularly bright at that point, and the trees in the orchard were spaced widely enough that we used them for cover while staying roughly in the middle of the grove as we moved through, each tree casting long, sharp shadows across the ground in the bright moonlight. Just before I actually entered the orchard myself, I heard that same noise again. This time, though, it sounded distinctly different, softer, and higher pitched than anything a deer or other animal would typically produce. I thought I heard what sounded like a little girl giggling somewhere nearby, a sound so clear and specific that it immediately stood out against the ordinary rustling of leaves and branches around us. That was not something my imagination would typically conjure on its own, not in the middle of a combat deployment in rural Kosovo, not while my mind was fully occupied with the practical demands of the mission at hand. I had been expecting wildlife, if anything, some rustling animal moving through brush, not the clear, high sound of a child's laughter drifting through the trees at that particular hour of the night. Elle had moved an additional 20 meters ahead of me this time before stopping to wait, so I moved into my next position, and he continued on. I crouched down next to a tree, watching carefully for anything at all that might explain what I had just heard. That was when the tree beside me caught my full attention. Within the natural knots and grain patterns of the bark, I noticed something that looked almost like a human face taking shape. I squinted, looking more closely, trying to convince myself it was simply my mind pulling a familiar shape out of random wood pattern, the way people sometimes see faces in clouds or wallpaper, a well-documented phenomenon that I had certainly experienced before under far less strange circumstances. But as I watched, a little girl's face clearly emerged from within the tree itself, and she turned toward me, smiling, raising a small hand to wave, giggling softly in a way that felt entirely gentle, rather than threatening or malicious in any sense. Her features were soft and childlike, nothing distorted or frightening about her expression, nothing that matched the kind of imagery I would have expected from fear or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Then she disappeared back into the tree, vanishing as completely and impossibly as she had appeared, leaving only ordinary bark and shadow where her face had been just seconds earlier. I stood there in absolute shock, my mind scrambling to process what I had just witnessed, my heart pounding harder than it had during the earlier scare in the tree line, harder even than during moments of genuine combat tension I had experienced on other missions. There was no chance whatsoever that I was going to walk back to my team and report what I had just seen, not while on an active mission in hostile territory, not while carrying the weight of responsibility for the newer guys we had brought along for training, and certainly not while risking my own credibility as someone the rest of the team relied on for calm, rational judgment under pressure. So instead, I simply bolted, catching up quickly to Elle, and kept my mouth completely shut about the entire experience. Recognizing that I had likely just lost my mind in some fashion, perhaps due to exhaustion or the accumulated stress of extended night operations, I decided the safest course of action was silence, at least until I had more time to process what had just happened on my own terms. We reached our extraction point without further incident and left the area behind, though I found myself unable to fully shake the image of that small, smiling face for the remainder of that night and well into the following days. 2 weeks passed after that mission. During that time, I was assigned to provide security for a team of combat engineers working through an area I happened to already be familiar with, while the rest of my regular team went out to patrol through the same general region where Elle and I had gotten spooked 2 weeks earlier, an assignment that generated plenty of jokes among the guys before they headed out. I still hadn't said a single word to anyone about what I had actually seen in that orchard. Privately, I was quite relieved to have an assignment that kept me away from returning to that particular area myself. So I headed out with the combat engineers, and together we located a minefield that had been recently laid in an area that local children apparently walked through every single day on their way to and from school or wherever else they needed to go. A discovery that carried real weight, given how easily that situation could have ended in tragedy for some family in the nearby village. The engineers handled informing the nearby village about the danger while beginning the careful work of clearing and detonating the mines in place. Methodical and professional, in a way that left me with real respect for the specialized work they did, in conditions like that. Work that required a level of precision and calm under pressure that I genuinely admired watching up close. Once the job was finished, I returned to base and was brought in to see my commanding officer, who thanked me for the work I had contributed to the mission, expressing genuine appreciation for the assistance I had provided in helping the engineering team locate and neutralize a threat that could have easily caused serious harm to civilians in the area. Feeling genuinely good about how the day had gone, I headed back to my barracks room, a space I rarely had much opportunity to actually spend time in, given how frequently we were out on missions. One of those small, cramped spaces that nonetheless felt like the closest thing to home during a deployment far away from anything familiar. None of the other guys had made it back yet by the time I arrived, so I settled in and had just started taking off my boots when the door burst open and the rest of the team came in, laughing loudly about something. The usual noise and energy that followed them back from any mission that had gone reasonably well. Elle was noticeably not laughing along with everyone else, instead telling the group to leave him alone in fairly blunt terms, his mood clearly darker than the rest of the team's. One of the other guys spotted me and immediately called out, "Hey man, Elle says he isn't going on patrol with us anymore in your favorite spot." I just grimaced slightly and waited quietly for the noise and teasing to settle down on its own, my mind already racing with questions I wasn't yet ready to ask out loud. A couple of days later, Elle and I found ourselves assigned together again, this time providing security for a group of scouts moving through another area entirely, well away from the orchard or anywhere connected to it. During a quiet stretch of that assignment, while we had a brief moment of downtime between checkpoints, he turned to me without any real warning and asked directly, "What did you see that night?" I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual despite the sudden tightness in my chest, and said, "I don't know. Just my imagination getting the better of me, I guess." What he said next sent an immediate chill straight up my spine, the kind of physical reaction that catches you completely off guard, even when some part of you had perhaps been half expecting it. He looked at me steadily, his expression serious in a way I rarely saw from him, and said, "I know you saw her. I saw her too. Tell me I am not crazy." I felt a strange kind of numbness settle over me in that moment, my mind racing to process what he had just admitted. I simply replied, "You're not crazy. Where did you see her?" He answered without hesitation, without a single moment of doubt in his voice, "Inside a tree." I want to be completely clear about something here, because it matters enormously to understanding just how unsettling this whole experience actually was. I had never given Elle any information whatsoever about what I had personally seen that night in the orchard. No details, no hints, nothing verbal or otherwise that could have possibly led him toward independently arriving at the same specific conclusion on his own. We hadn't discussed the orchard at all in the 2 weeks since that mission, not even in passing. Not even during the good-natured teasing the rest of the team had thrown his way about refusing to patrol that area again. When I saw the little girl inside that tree, Elle had already moved a full 40 meters ahead of my position, well beyond any reasonable line of sight that would have allowed him to see what I was looking at, let alone witness the exact same impossible detail that I had witnessed myself, down to the specific detail of her appearing from within the bark rather than simply standing nearby or emerging from behind the tree trunk. In the years since that deployment, I have turned that particular night over in my mind more times than I could possibly count, trying to find some rational explanation that would neatly account for everything that happened. I have considered exhaustion as a factor, the particular kind of sleep deprivation and hypervigilance that comes with extended night operations. The way the mind under that kind of sustained stress can sometimes produce vivid, convincing hallucinations that feel every bit as real as anything actually happening in front of you. I have read about documented cases of soldiers experiencing similar sensory distortions during long deployments, exhaustion and adrenaline combining in ways that can genuinely fool even highly trained observers under the right circumstances. That explanation might have satisfied me completely, might have let me file the entire experience away as simply another strange but explainable byproduct of an especially demanding deployment if L hadn't independently described the exact same experience weeks later, using almost identical language, describing a location and a specific detail he had no possible way of knowing about through any normal means available to him. I have also thought about the specific location itself, that orchard sitting near a rural village in a country that had endured so much conflict and loss over the preceding years. I don't know the full history of that particular stretch of land, whether children had once played there before the wars reshaped so much of the region, whether that specific spot held some kind of history I was never privy to as an outside soldier passing through on a single mission. Kosovo, like much of the surrounding region, carries a long and often tragic history, stretching back generations, layered with conflict after conflict. And it never struck me as unreasonable to imagine that some places might hold on to fragments of that history in ways science cannot easily explain or measure. I have no way of confirming any of that. No way of researching the specific plot of land we passed through that night, given how long ago the deployment ended and how limited my access to detailed local records ever was, but I have found myself wondering, more than once, whether whatever we both witnessed carried some connection to the broader tragedy and loss that had swept through that region during years of conflict before our deployment ever began. What continues to unsettle me most, even now thinking back on it after all this time, is not simply the strangeness of seeing a small girl's face emerge from within the bark of a tree, waving and giggling in a way that felt entirely gentle rather than threatening. It is the fact that L saw the exact same thing, independently, separated from me by enough distance and enough obstruction that any normal explanation involving shared sightlines or simple suggestion simply doesn't hold up under any real scrutiny, no matter how many times I have tried to construct an alternative theory that might account for it. Two trained soldiers, operating separately within the same general area, but without any direct visual contact with each other in that specific moment, both witnessed a small child's face appear briefly within a tree. Both witnessed her smile and wave before vanishing back into the wood, and neither of us had said a single word to the other about it until L finally brought it up himself, weeks later during an entirely unrelated assignment, in a conversation neither of us had planned or anticipated having. I have never been someone particularly inclined toward believing in ghosts or spirits or anything of that nature, not before that deployment, and honestly, not entirely even after it, despite everything I experienced that night. Military training tends to push you firmly toward rational, practical thinking, toward trusting concrete evidence over feeling or intuition, and most of my career reinforced that mindset consistently across the various deployments and missions I was part of over the years, teaching me to question, verify, and rely on tangible proof rather than gut feeling whenever possible. But that particular night in that particular orchard remains the one experience I have never been able to fully explain away using any of the practical, rational frameworks I would normally reach for first, no matter how many angles I have tried approaching it from in the years since. Elle and I never really discussed it again in any great detail after that conversation during the scout patrol. It felt, somehow, like something that didn't need further examination, like we had both simply confirmed to each other that neither of us had imagined it, and that confirmation alone was enough to let the subject rest, without needing to dig any deeper into what it might have actually meant or where it might have come from. We continued serving together for the remainder of that deployment, running additional missions through different areas, though I noticed Elle was noticeably more reluctant to volunteer for anything that would take us back through that specific stretch of terrain near the orchard, a reluctance the rest of the team continued to gently rib him about, without ever fully understanding the real reason behind it. I never corrected their assumptions or offered any explanation of my own, content to let the joke stand rather than reopen a conversation I still wasn't entirely sure I wanted to have with anyone beyond L himself. I think about that deployment often, the long nights of careful movement through unfamiliar terrain, the constant awareness required to keep an entire team safe while moving largely unseen through hostile or uncertain territory. Most of those memories carry the particular weight that combat deployments tend to carry, a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and the quiet trauma that comes with operating in genuinely dangerous conditions for extended stretches of time. Memories that surface unexpectedly even now, years removed from active service. But that one specific night, the giggling in the trees, the face appearing and disappearing within the bark, and especially L's confirmation weeks later that he had witnessed the identical impossible thing from a completely separate vantage point, stands apart from everything else I experienced during my time there, refusing to fit neatly into any of the explanations I have tried applying to it over the years since. I don't know what that little girl was, or why she appeared to both of us that particular night in that particular orchard, smiling and waving with what felt like genuine warmth rather than any kind of malice or threat. I don't know if it connects somehow to the difficult history of that region, to lives lost during years of conflict before we ever arrived, or whether it was something else entirely that defies any explanation I could reasonably offer. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is that it happened, that another trained, rational soldier witnessed the same impossible thing independently, and that neither of us has ever found a way to fully dismiss it as simple imagination, no matter how many years have passed since that particular deployment came to an end. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, on the bright moonlight filtering through the orchard trees, on the sound of soft giggling drifting through the branches, I feel that same strange mixture of unease and quiet wonder settle over me, a feeling I have simply learned to accept rather than fully resolve.